Drogon soared eastward across the sky, a dark shadow against the reddening horizon. His great wings raked the air with every downbeat, stirring winds that carried the scent of ash and salt. Clutched in his talons, draped limply across his scaled forelimbs, was Daenerys Targaryen. Dead, her pale hair stained with drying blood, her skin taking on that alabaster stillness. She was as light to him as a whisper, though the significance of her weight pressed upon the creature with incomprehensible gravity. Drogon uttered a low rumble in his throat, neither a roar of triumph nor a cry of lament, but something between, a tone that seemed to echo with desperate longing. Below him lay the wide oceans of the world, miles of unbroken blue as far as an eagle's eye could discern. Yet the dragon did not swerve or hesitate. An ancient instinct guided him, possibly some memory woven into his very bones, carried through centuries of Targaryen magic and dragon lore, led him east across the waters. Far behind, the armies and lords of Westeros reeled from the final battle in King's Landing. Jon Snow had plunged a dagger beneath Daenerys' heart, her dream of a broken wheel, undone in a single tragic stroke. All that remained was Drogon's unspoken vow, to carry her away from the site of her betrayal. He flew for hours, then days, leaving behind the charred ruins of the Red Keep and all that had been promised. The rhythm of his flight became almost trance-like. Through storms and harsh winds, he refused to slow. His body was a black arrow pointed to the east. Daenerys' silvery hair occasionally stirred in the wind, as though in faint protest at the cold blast. But she did not wake, and her chest did not rise. And yet, there was warmth nestled somewhere in the hush of Drogon's heart. Perhaps dragons possessed some subtlety of magic beyond mortal understanding. Perhaps the unspoken bond with their riders transcended even death. Along the journey, he circled once over a desolate coastline dotted with jagged rock and spindly iron trees before pressing on. He seemed to test the air, as if scenting out something. If the wind carried no clues, then memory must. The winged beast traveled by night, guided by starlight and the silent call of the blood of old Valyria. Many believed Valyria to be an accursed place, smoke and ruin, a labyrinth of haunted waters, where the doom still churned in hidden craters. It was from Valyria that the Targaryens had fled centuries ago. The freehold had perished in an instant of cataclysmic wrath, unleashing flame and molten stone. Yet some whispered that pockets of the old power lingered. Superstitious sailors told tales of monstrous shapes in the ruins, of mists that bewitched the mind, illusions that drove men mad. No one who sailed the smoking sea willingly returned. But dragons were of Valyria, not men, and something in Drogon's spirit beckoned him home. At last, a darker shape loomed upon the horizon. The sea fumed around a broken peninsula that jutted out like a black sword. The sky itself seemed to warp, as though the air were thick with the sorcery of ages. Clouds twisted in unnatural shapes. Faint pulses of red flickered in the distance, reflecting in smoky plumes that rose from ruined spires. Everything about that place hummed with menace and sorrow. Ancient basalt towers, half collapsed into the sea, were glimpsed through the swirling haze. The reek was unbearable to most living things, a pungent stench of sulfur, decay, and volcanic fumes. But Drogon pressed on. He alighted upon a rocky outcrop that jutted from the ruins of a city once mighty beyond mortal measure. Broken causeways and sundered arches hinted at proud avenues that had once teemed with sorcerer lords and their slaves. The stone under Drogon's claws was slick with algae and brine, crusted over from centuries of exposure to the smoking sea's poisonous exhalations. With a gentleness that would have surprised any onlooker, he set Daenerys' body down. Something in his obsidian eyes flashed. He touched her hair with the tip of his snout, exhaling a breath so hot that it shimmered in the air. Daenerys' face remained serene in death, as though she merely slept. Yet there was no color in her cheeks or lips, only the pallor that came when the last heartbeat ceased. Drogon nudged her softly, as though he expected her to stir at any moment, to command him onward in some new conquest. But she remained still. Restless, he rose on all fours and began to circle, tail lashing. A faint, keening sound escaped him, The place felt charged. Perhaps it was only the relic of old enchantments, swirling in the gloom, but one could believe some lingering fragment of the Targaryen line might be welcomed here. Shadows lengthened as the day wore on. The mists thickened, carrying an acrid warmth that stung the eyes. The towers rising from the sunken outskirts of Valyria appeared like broken teeth, and the wind wove ghastly moans through the archways. Drogon, uneasy, hovered near Daenerys's body. A hush settled in, broken only by the occasional cough of volcanic discharge. For a long stretch, nothing happened. Then, just as dusk crept across the horizon, a light flared deep within the city's heart, an eerie greenish phosphorescence visible through the cracks of fallen walls. Drogon's head snapped up. He sniffed the air. The light pulsed once, twice, thrice, and then flickered out. Like a man following a beacon, Drogon gathered Daenerys' corpse in his claws once more, lifting her with infinite care, and launched himself into the gloom, heading toward the source of that uncanny glow. He flew only a short distance, weaving past the shattered remains of a colossal dome that had once crowned the greatest temple of Valyria. There, in a courtyard strewn with rubble and half-submerged pillars, waited a figure cloaked in robes of tattered black. Pale hands glinted in the gloom. The face was not immediately visible, hidden by a hood and the swirl of cinder-filled air. Yet the presence was unmistakably human, or something close to human. Drogon roared a challenge, his voice echoing across the ruined city, reverberating off ancient stone. Yet the figure did not flee or cower. They lifted a single hand, beckoning with quiet confidence, and from beneath the hood came a voice that was strangely melodic, though thick with an accent that had not been heard in centuries. The words were in Valyrian, a form older than High Valyrian, a dialect that might have died with the doom. They were sibilant, rolling, unearthly. Drogon lowered himself, wings half-furled, uncertain but unable to resist this pull. The robed stranger called out again, the voice low, echoing with timeless power. As if responding to an ancient pact, Drogon placed Daenerys gently on the ground and stepped back, smoke streaming from his nostrils. He was ready to unleash a furnace of flame should the stranger prove hostile. But the robed figure did not threaten. They only knelt beside the fallen queen. Thin white fingers brushed Daenerys' hair from her face. The figure raised its head, and in the dim glow, a visage emerged, neither young nor old, with cheeks gaunt and eyes that shimmered with a faint luminescence. The mouth moved in a silent incantation. It was impossible to tell whether the figure was male or female. The features were androgynous, timeless. In that hush, the robed one peeled back a portion of cloth from their sleeve, revealing an intricate brand on their forearm, a sigil formed of twisting glyphs reminiscent of Valyrian glyphs but edged with runes rarely seen. Whether it was a mark of a mage or a priest of some lost faith was unclear. A trembling started in the stones beneath them, subtle at first, then rippling outward. Drogon hissed, uncertain. The robed figure pressed a palm to Daenerys' chest, just above the wound that had ended her life. The black robes fluttered, animated by some gust of conjured wind. Overhead, the clouds spiraled into a vortex, swirling red and white. The figure whispered again, and a spark of greenish phosphorescence arced between their fingers and Daenerys' skin. It was as if an invisible storm crackled around them, concentrated in that courtyard among the broken pillars, focusing on the silver-haired queen who lay there like an alabaster effigy. From the broken spires around them, serpentine shapes seemed to slither in the darkness, distorted illusions or perhaps remnants of lost dragons that once soared over Valyria. Drogon watched, enraptured by something beyond mortal ken. He recognized a primal power that spoke to his own draconic heart. He inched closer, growling softly, flame flickering in the back of his throat. There was no aggression in his posture now, only anxiety, fear, and an undeniable hope. The robed figure continued to chant, each syllable echoing off the ancient walls, resonating in the deepest hollows of the earth. Sulphurous fumes curled through the courtyard, mixing with the taste of salt from the sea, swirling around the dais of half-toppled statues. The chanting rose in intensity, culminating in a sharp cry that seemed to pierce the barrier between life and death. Daenerys's body twitched. Her lips parted in a gasp that did not quite produce breath. The robed figure pressed harder, luminous eyes narrowing as they poured energy into her. In that moment, it seemed as though all the latent magic of Valyria surged. The ground shook violently, cracks opening along the broken pavement. Flecks of green and red flame burst from fissures in the stone, and somewhere far off, a bestial shriek answered like thunder. Drogon bellowed, rearing back, tail lashing. Sparks rained down in an infernal shower. With a final exhalation, the robed stranger collapsed over Daenerys's body. All around them, the glow subsided, the fissures closed, and the swirling clouds overhead drifted back into a sullen darkness. Only the faint reek of char and the glow of molten rock somewhere below the city's surface remained. Silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Drogon ventured closer, nudging Daenerys's shoulder with the tip of his snout. Still she lay unmoving, though her body no longer had that awful pallor. There was a subtle shift, as though the slightest bit of color had returned to her lips. Minutes passed in suffocating quiet. The robed figure did not stir, as though they had poured the last of their being into the attempt. The city's ghosts shifted through the shadows, stirring the ash-laden wind with faint moans. The only living presence was Drogon, and the only movement was the slow coiling of smoke from his nostrils. Then, barely noticeable, Daenerys's chest rose with a shallow flutter. It fell. It rose again. A tremor rippled through her limbs. Her eyes fluttered behind closed lids. She drew in a labored breath, the first in many hours, rattling in her throat with the sound of one who had walked in darkness too long. She coughed, and her body curled as if seized by an excruciating pain. Drogon crooned, lowering his massive head, his eyes gleaming gold in the twilight. Softly, carefully, his snout brushed her cheek. She moaned, eyes still closed, as if struggling to remember how to open them. At last, her eyelids lifted, revealing irises that were dull at first, as if she didn't truly see. Then, recognition flared. She gasped again, that simple act of breathing so monumental after death's stillness. She tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged. Her hand reached out blindly, brushing against the black scales of her dragon. She felt warmth from Drogon's flesh, and her fingers spasmed, clinging to the living rock of his hide. Drogon's entire body seemed to quake with relief. He uttered a deep, rumbling purr, something akin to joy. If a dragon could weep, perhaps he would have then, letting tears of flame dribble across the ground. Instead, he lowered his head more firmly, letting Daenerys lean against him. She was trembling fiercely, cold seeping through her limbs as though death's frost still clung to her veins. One word passed her lips, cracked and quiet. Dracarys. It was barely more than a breath, but Drogon recognized it. The magical bond between them thrummed alive again, as if it had never quite vanished but had gone dormant in the quiet gloom of her demise. She coughed again, a raw sound that signaled her body was struggling to restore what had been lost. The robed stranger still lay motionless, collapsed in a heap nearby. Daenerys's gaze flicked in that direction, but her mind was disoriented, memories a haze of blood and betrayal. She blinked, trying to speak, but only ragged whimpers came out. Drogon curled around her in a protective arc, a living wall of muscle and scale. For a time, the two remained there as the last dregs of daylight sank beneath the western horizon and the smoking sea's gloom pressed in. Sometime in the blackness between dusk and dawn, Daenerys found the strength to sit upright. Her lungs burned with each breath and her heart fluttered at an irregular pace. She felt as though she had plunged into a realm of nightmares and emerged gasping for air. Slowly, recollection stirred. She remembered the throne room, the chilling hush of the hall, Jon Snow's tortured expression as he slid a dagger into her heart. Ice seemed to form in her core at the memory. A wave of anguish pulsed through her, so consuming she had to clutch Drogon's flank to steady herself. The dragon rumbled softly, pressing closer, as though to say, "I am here." Through cracked lips, Daenerys managed a whisper. "Am I alive?" Her voice was not directed at anyone in particular, for she was unsure if she spoke to Drogon, the robed figure, or the city of ghosts around her. The swirling ash answered in bleak silence. At last, the robed stranger stirred. A thin arm rose, bracing against the ground, and the figure slowly pulled themselves into a sitting position. Their hood had fallen back, revealing a face that was angular and strangely beautiful, yet eerie in its otherworldliness. The eyes glowed faintly with residual power, though the figure seemed exhausted. They said something in Valyrian, a dialect older and harsher than Daenerys was accustomed to, though she understood fragments. She caught the words for Dragon Queen and restored amid the torrent. Then the stranger coughed, a wet, hacking sound. Something dark and viscous spattered on the stones, only to be lost in the gloom. Summoning her own knowledge of High Valyrian, Daenerys croaked, Who are you?" The stranger's lips curved in an inscrutable smile, and they responded in halting common tongue. "Eyekeeper." Of the old ways? Their voice was androgynous, whispery. You died. He brought you here. The blood of Valyria runs in your veins. You are Targaryen. Daenerys blinked. Each moment of consciousness magnified her raw pain, and she realized she still wore the clothes she had died in, now stiff with her dried blood. Her chest throbbed where the dagger had entered. Yet under her palm, she felt the faint yet real beat of her own heart. What did you do to me? She asked. The stranger exhaled. I gave you back your breath. But a price was paid. A price. Her voice shook, uncertain. Had she merely traded one bondage for another? Was she now enthralled to some dread power? The figure's glow dimmed further, as if the energies sustaining them were nearly spent. Magic, old and deep. It requires more than words. A pause. A portion of life, my own. Bound to you now. Drogon hissed, shifting his bulk uneasily. Daenerys was not sure whether to recoil or show gratitude. The idea that someone had willingly sacrificed part of their life force to bring her back was staggering. She had touched on the powers of life and death before, witnessed the birth of her dragons through fire and blood, but this felt different, more deliberate and arcane, imbued with the lost spells of a doomed empire. She stared at her resurrector, searching for some sign of ill intent, but she saw only weariness and something akin to reverence in those luminescent eyes. Why do this for me? A faint smile curled on the stranger's mouth. Prophecy, perhaps? Or destiny? The Dragon Queen must not die yet. Valyria still has secrets for you. With that, the stranger's eyelids drooped. The frail body wavered, then collapsed anew as though the last spark of energy had burned away. Daenerys felt an impulse to reach out to offer help, though she had none to give. Her own limbs trembled with weakness. She had no memory of what existed between the realm of life and death, no recollection of seeing a light or hearing voices, only darkness, a suffocating emptiness, and then the pain of being thrust back into a body that was not yet healed. She cradled her chest, feeling the scabbed wound beneath her soiled clothing. Every breath was an act of will. She wanted to stand, but the strength eluded her. At dawn, the smoky haze above the city glowed a sickly orange. Daenerys dozed restlessly, her head pillowed against Drogon's flank, nightmares rolling through her mind. Sometimes she was in the throne room again, feeling Jon's dagger pierce her. Sometimes she saw Missandei on the walls of King's Landing, about to die. Other times she heard the screech of thousands of voices chanting her name, or the cries of the innocent in the city's streets as Drogon's fire rained upon them. She moaned, twisting in half-sleep, not sure whether to blame the visions on the resurrection or her own guilt. At length, she forced herself awake. Her body was battered, but not undone. The robed stranger remained prone nearby, breathing shallowly. Drogon watched over them both with anxious alertness, occasionally shifting his stance to peer into the shadows. Daenerys tested her voice, still rough. We need shelter. Water. Her lips were parched, and her throat felt coated with ash. She slid a hand along Drogon's side, urging him to help her rise. With a groan, she got to her feet, swaying like a newborn foal. The broken courtyard around them revealed half-buried columns, fragments of statues, and rubble from what might have been a grand palace. Valyria had once been the seat of the greatest civilization in the known world, but now it was a grave of black stone and smoking ruins. Yet perhaps if any place held hidden corners unaffected by the ruin, she might find a sliver of safety. Pulling at Drogon's massive wing, she guided him closer to the robed figure. We can't leave them here to die. She did not know if the stranger was indeed friend or foe, but they had saved her life. That act weighed heavily in Daenerys' mind. Drogon seemed dubious, but he sniffed at the figure, and when Daenerys tugged at the black robes, the dragon gently helped lift the limp body in his claws. Daenerys clambered onto Drogon's back with difficulty. She settled in, wincing with every breath, then signaled him to take flight. He rose into the gloom, the heavy beat of his wings kicking up dust and debris. Daenerys clung to his scaled neck, the robed stranger cradled carefully in his talons as he soared above collapsed domes and fractured spires. The city spread out in a labyrinthine sprawl of canals, melted towers, and labyrinths that had caved into the molten depths. Smoke and sulfur hissed from fissures that dotted the landscape. Steam rose from the waters around the ruins. The very air felt like the exhalation of a wounded giant. Through this lethal panorama, Daenerys scanned for a place that might provide shelter from the toxic environment. Finally, she spotted what might have been a large, half-intact temple built of fused black stone. Part of its roof was gone, but thick columns stood in a ring around a central dais. Perhaps it would be enough to keep the worst of the fumes at bay. She guided Drogon downward. He landed on a partially collapsed terrace, sending shards of stone clattering. Carefully, he laid the stranger's body on a patch of relatively smooth floor. Daenerys slid off his back, nearly collapsing on her knees from the effort. She crawled over to the robed figure and checked for breath. They were still alive barely. The face was pale, beads of sweat forming along the high cheekbones. Daenerys scooped up one of the stranger's limp hands and murmured, "Can you hear me?" No response. She peered at the brand on their forearm, trying to recall any lore about such a mark. It looked like an amalgam of Valyrian glyphs, the kind she had seen on the old dragonstone chairs, but also something more arcane. She felt a hum, an almost electric charge, but only for an instant. She sighed, exhaustion bearing down on her. She had so many questions. Was she truly alive? What had she been brought back to do? She remembered her last words to Jon, the heartbreak, the betrayal. And now here she was far from Westeros, in the heart of Valyria, the land of her ancestors, presumably with a second chance. Should she have died? Would she become something monstrous, an abomination twisted by dark sorcery? She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat rattle against her ribs. The despair that flooded her was almost too deep to bear. Drogon nuzzled her, the warmth of his breath a comfort against the chill in her soul. She managed a faint stroke along his jaw. "We're together," she whispered to him. Just as it was meant to be. But she remembered the ashes of King's Landing, the carnage of her final campaign. She recalled the ring of betrayal in Jon's eyes, how he had pleaded with her to show mercy, how he had kissed her and driven a knife home. A swirl of conflict raged within her. Should she hate him or pity him? Perhaps both. Yet that question was overshadowed by a new reality. She was no longer the Daenerys Targaryen who had led armies and liberated cities. She was something else, fashioned anew in Valyria's molten cradle. Her thirst grew unbearable. She needed water, and so did the stranger. She glanced around the temple ruins, searching for anything that might serve as a container or a cistern. She spied a cracked urn near a partially collapsed wall. Staggering over, she found it empty. The city, so near the sea, might have hidden pockets of fresh water if one knew where to look. But the smoking sea itself was fouled by volcanic discharge. Still, she could hear the drip of water somewhere in the shadows. Perhaps a natural spring bubbled up from the depths through certain cracks, carrying fresh water from an underground source. Digging into her waning reserves of energy, Daenerys followed the sound into a dim corridor. The floor sloped downward, and what remained of a mosaic glimmered under layers of grime and soot. She steadied herself against the wall, each step sending flares of pain through her chest. She was still so close to death that every motion felt precarious, as though her soul might slip free of her body. Yet an iron determination spurred her on. She would not let her resurrection end in a slow death from thirst in the heart of her ancestors' land. Eventually, she came upon a small pool formed by dripping water from a fissure in the ceiling. It was no larger than a washing basin, and it looked clean, at least as clean as anything in these cursed ruins could appear. Daenerys knelt beside it. She cupped a trembling hand into the pool, bringing the water to her lips. Though it tasted faintly of minerals, it seemed drinkable enough. She drank carefully at first, mindful that her body might reject it. But it stayed down, and her parched throat felt a glimmer of relief. She looked around for a way to carry some water back to the robed stranger. Spotting a broken shard of pottery, she dipped it carefully into the pool. Water dribbled from the cracks in the shard, but she managed to keep enough within it to make the effort worthwhile. Inch by excruciating inch, she returned up the sloping corridor, bracing herself whenever a tremor from deep within the city rumbled. She finally emerged back into the main temple space where Drogon stood watch. The robed figure remained unconscious. Kneeling beside them, Daenerys gently tilted their head back and trickled the water into their mouth. A bit of color returned to the figure's lips, and their throat bobbed as they swallowed. She repeated this process twice more, ferrying water from the hidden drip to the dais. By the time she was done, she felt faint, but her thirst was sated, and she had managed to give the stranger enough that they no longer looked at death's door. The temple was quiet except for Drogon's occasional chuffing and the distant rumble of volcanic activity. She settled down near the robed figure, too exhausted to do more. Sleep claimed her again, a dark wave that dragged her into dreams. She dreamed of a wide plain beneath a red sky where dragons roamed free and unbound. In her dream, she was a child again, running through fields of ash, seeking her family. She saw Viserys, looking young and kind, beckoning her. But when she reached him, his face crumbled into ashes. Then the plain was filled with the wails of thousands who had perished under her dragon fire. She tried to speak, to tell them she was sorry, but her words were lost in the roar of conflagration. Then the ground split open, revealing an abyss, and out of that chasm a monstrous shape emerged, an ancient dragon, more massive than Balerion the Black Dread, with eyes that burned like coals. It fixed her with a baleful stare, and she felt her heart seize. She woke abruptly, lungs heaving, hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. The temple was awash in gloom. By the feeble light that filtered through the broken roof, she saw the robed figure sitting upright, leaning against a column. The figure's hood was up once more, but the faint phosphorescence in their gaze was visible beneath it. They nodded at her. "You have awakened," the stranger murmured, in that same accented common tongue. Daenerys pushed herself upright, wincing as she did. "Yes." She paused, voice still weak. "Are you well?" The stranger tilted their head. "I live," they whispered. "That must be enough." Then they turned their gaze to Daenerys. "The bond is sealed. Our fates entwine. Daenerys of House Targaryen." A knot tightened in Daenerys' stomach. She had not told the stranger her name, but then again it was no secret. She was well known across continents. "What bond?" "My life force was the key to bridge your mortal coil with your spirit," the stranger explained. "There is a tether now. If one of us dies, the other suffers the consequence." Daenerys' mouth went dry. "That means if I die again, you die too?" "Likely yes," the stranger said calmly. "Our fates are not entirely separate. But fear not. My life is less anchored." She shuddered, unsure if that was meant to comfort. A swirl of guilt rose within her. She had not asked for this sacrifice, yet it was given. "What do I call you?" The figure hesitated, then offered a name in Valyrian that sounded like Malthero, though the unfamiliar dialect made it difficult to parse precisely. "That name will suffice," they said quietly. "Malthero," Daenerys repeated, letting the syllables settle. She felt a sharp pang in her chest. She was still wearing the stained remnants of the clothing she had died in. She smelled of death and ash. "Why risk yourself to save me?" Malthero shrugged. "It was foretold that the last scion of Valyria's purest blood would return. Some of us kept watch. Your presence here is an omen of what we cannot yet say." Foretold, Daenerys thought bitterly. She had grown weary of prophecy and destiny, each yoking her to grand designs that led to war, betrayal, and heartbreak. "I have had enough of omens and destiny," she spat, surprising herself with the anger in her voice. "I wanted to break the cycle, not feed it." "Yes," Malthero acknowledged softly. "You sought to shatter chains. The question is, do you still?" Daenerys paused, her thoughts roiling. She had wanted to free the world from tyranny, only to become something monstrous in the eyes of many. The ambition of a conqueror had burned in her blood, fanned by betrayals and iron resolves. Yet now she was hollow, uncertain of who she was or what she wanted. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did terrible things." Malthero regarded her quietly. "You did what you believed was necessary." "Necessity," Daenerys repeated, her voice catching. She remembered the smells of burning flesh, the screams of the innocent. "In war, I convinced myself that all was justified. But the cost?" A swirl of guilt threatened to strangle her. "What if I was wrong?" A moment of silence stretched, heavy as iron. Then Malthero gestured weakly to the ruin around them. "Valyria was once great, so the stories say. Its lords believed they held destiny in their hands, that their magic and dragons made them gods among men. But pride devoured them, and the city burned from within." Their voice turned somber. "Those with power often fail to see the line between justice and vanity. Perhaps, in your second life, you will find a better way." Daenerys' throat tightened. She thought of all the naive hopes she had once clung to, of forging a better world. After losing everything, now she was in Valyria's lifeless skeleton. Yet there was no straightforward path forward. "What must I do?" she asked, though she wasn't entirely sure whom she was asking. Drogon, standing guard near a fractured column, snorted as if in answer, releasing a puff of acrid smoke. Malthero lifted their gaze, which glowed faintly in the gloom. "That is for you to decide. You live now, bound by sorcery and your dragon's devotion. If you desire atonement, you must seek it. If you desire vengeance, you must strike for it. Magic weaves through Valyria's ruins still, old and full of peril. Some knowledge here might restore your strength or grant you new power, but it is not free from danger." Daenerys rose unsteadily to her feet. Her muscles ached, her chest felt aflame, but she stood. "I will not cower," she said, though her voice was soft. She looked upon Drogon, who returned her gaze with a faithful glimmer in his golden eyes. Tears pricked at Daenerys' own eyes, unbidden. She recalled how he had carried her body from the place of her end, refusing to abandon her. How he had roared his grief upon the destruction of the Iron Throne. For a moment, love and sorrow mingled so fiercely she could barely remain standing. She wanted to bury her face against him, to beg forgiveness for everything. With a trembling hand, she reached out, stroking the dragon's massive flank. "You saved me," she whispered to him. "And you," she turned to Malthero, "risked everything. I don't know how to repay either of you, but I will not waste this second life." A faint smile touched Malthero's lips. "Then let us see what Valyria offers." The rest of that day and the next passed in a haze of convalescence and quiet exploration. Daenerys stayed near the temple ruins, venturing only short distances to gather more fresh water or scavenge for anything useful among the rubble. She found scraps of cloth that she rinsed as best she could, fashioning them into makeshift bandages for the wound on her chest. Malthero mostly rested, though the robed figure occasionally guided her attention to certain glyphs or cracked murals that hinted at hidden passages below. Drogon roamed overhead at times, hunting the strange creatures that slithered among the smoking crags. Once, he brought back the charred carcass of a reptilian beast with bulging eyes and a jaw lined with needle-like teeth. Daenerys watched him feast, trying not to recoil. Life here was harsh, primal. She gradually regained some strength, though she remained fragile and easily fatigued. Each night, she was haunted by nightmares, visions of her past, of the cities she had burned, of the blood on her hands. She awoke each time in a cold sweat, glancing about the ruins in confusion. At least Drogon and Malthero were there, silent testaments that her existence was not a mere phantom dream. On the third day, Malthero beckoned Daenerys to a particular section of the temple's floor where an ancient mosaic had been partly revealed under centuries of ash. With measured movements, Malthero brushed away debris, revealing the faint outline of a large dragon crest coiled around a fiery orb. "This was once a place of worship, I believe," the robed figure murmured. "But not worship of gods as you know them." Daenerys knelt, tracing the mosaic with her fingertips. The detail was extraordinary, though worn by time and the doom's upheaval. She could make out runes around the edges. What were they worshipping? Malthero's eyes flickered. Power itself, perhaps? The flames that shaped Valyria's dragons. Some called it the living fire, the breath of creation that gave birth to magic in this land. Daenerys recalled stories from her youth of how Valyrian sorcerers tamed dragons through spells and bindings, forging an empire unmatched in the annals of history. She thought of her own experiences, how she had walked into Drogo's funeral pyre and emerged unburnt with 3 hatchlings. That had been a miracle of fire and blood. Was it the same power these ancient sorcerers had tapped? She glanced at Malthero. "You believe that if we delve deeper, we might find, what? A source of that power. Artifacts, knowledge. Some spark of the old ways that may guide you. But be warned, the deeper we go, the more the doom's shadow lingers. It could be lethal." Daenerys pressed her lips together. Part of her recoiled at the idea of harnessing more power. Hadn't she done enough harm? Another part of her recognized that knowledge might be crucial if she was to survive this cursed land, or if she was to eventually return to the wider world. She looked at Drogon, who now rested near a gargoyle-like statue. A small ripple of a memory touched her when she had once been called the breaker of chains when she had freed slaves in Essos. That woman had believed power was a means to do good, to end injustice. Had she lost that woman entirely? She rose. "Take me to these depths. I need to see for myself what Valyria hides." Malthero nodded, stepping aside to reveal a cracked stairwell descending into the gloom. The opening was partially concealed by fallen debris, but with Drogon's help, his claws scraping and pushing aside blocks of stone, they managed to clear a passable route. The air that wafted up was hot, metallic, tinged with the tang of sulfur. Torchlight would have been ideal, but they had no torches. Instead, Malthero murmured something, and a small orb of greenish light sparked into existence between their palms. It glowed like foxfire, illuminating the stairwell walls in an unearthly hue. Daenerys felt a flutter of trepidation. Magic had wrought wonders and horrors alike. She swallowed, gathering her courage, and followed Malthero down the steps. Drogon let out a low growl, disliking the narrow confines. He would not fit in the passageway, so he waited at the entrance, peering after them with anxious eyes. Daenerys paused to lay a hand on his snout. "I'll be back soon," she promised, though she could not help a tremor of uncertainty. Malthero descended slowly, the conjured light revealing walls inscribed with more glyphs, whorls of script that wove in patterns reminiscent of dragon wings. The corridors twisted and turned, sometimes opening into small crypt-like chambers, sometimes forcing the two explorers to duck beneath half-collapsed arches. Each step took them deeper into the bowels of the city, into the domain where the true face of Valyrian sorcery might still lurk. They passed a line of bas-relief sculptures depicting robed figures with elongated skulls, each holding an orb of flame. Some images displayed dragons perched on their shoulders or coiled around their legs. Others showed bound men and women, slaves, offering tribute in the form of hearts or other grisly tokens. Daenerys' stomach churned. She felt a pang of horror. Valyria's grandeur was built upon rivers of blood. She knew the Targaryens had once been part of that world. Did these images reflect her heritage? Malthero paused at one depiction that showed a crowned figure, arms raised in triumph, with half a dozen dragons circling overhead. "This might be a representation of Enar the Exile's kin," Malthero said softly, "or some other great dragon lord." The lines of Targaryen ancestry traced back to such figures. Daenerys studied the carving. The crowned figure's face was eroded by centuries, but it still conveyed an eerie majesty. She felt the sting of conflicting emotions: pride at her Valyrian lineage, revulsion at the cruelty that lineage had entailed. She continued onward with Malthero, the only sound their careful footfalls and the faint dripping of mineral-laden water from the stone overhead. After what felt like an eternity in those winding corridors, they reached a larger chamber, its vaulted ceiling intact, though cracked. The space was dominated by a great circular design on the floor, a spiral of inlaid metal that gleamed greenish-black in the sorcerous light. At its center stood a pedestal, carved with runes so dense they seemed to coil upon themselves. Above the pedestal was a curious structure. 3 fused dragon skulls formed a triangular arch, each skull nearly as large as a human torso. Their empty eye sockets seemed to watch the chamber, and the rancid stench of ancient brimstone clung to the air. Malthero raised their glowing orb. "I can feel the power here," they whispered, voice tinged with awe. "Be cautious." Daenerys stepped forward, heart pounding. She could sense something swirling in the atmosphere, an intensity that made her hair prickle at the nape of her neck. She thought she heard whispers, too faint to discern words. A wave of dizziness struck her. She stumbled, catching herself on a broken pillar near the edge of the chamber. Heat radiated from the spiral in the floor as though molten rock flowed beneath it. She took a breath, steadying herself. The memory of her rebirth in the funeral pyre came surging up, fire consuming her, yet leaving her unburnt. This place radiated that same primal force, but older, more alien. She could almost imagine the dragon lords of old standing around the spiral in dark conclave, chanting incantations to bind dragons to their will. Malthero approached the pedestal carefully. Symbols were etched in a ring around its top, swirling in tight clusters. "This is a focusing stone," they murmured. "The old sorcerers used it to draw forth draconic essences. Careful, it may still be active." They brushed their hand across the runes and the air hummed. "It resonates with you, Daenerys." She swallowed hard. "With me?" "Yes. Your blood is of the pure Valyrian line, and you were reborn amidst dragon fire. That ties you to the same forces that once thrived here. Perhaps you can command it." Daenerys hesitated, stepping to the pedestal's edge. The swirling metal in the floor seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. Her mind flashed with memory, the birth of her dragons in Khal Drogo's pyre, the first time Drogon had responded to her call. It felt like standing on the threshold of an inferno again. Was she truly prepared for what might happen if she tapped into such power? Her eyes flicked to Malthero. "What do I do?" Malthero's expression was unreadable beneath the hood. "Place your hands on the stone. Focus your will. Let it feel your essence." Daenerys' chest tightened. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood at the pedestal. She raised her hands slowly, trembling. Could this be a step toward redemption, or would it be a path to further destruction? The memory of King's Landing still burned in her mind. Was she truly worthy of harnessing more magic? Yet some stubborn spark inside her insisted she was still Daenerys Stormborn, the unburnt, the mother of dragons. She placed her palms upon the pedestal. A jolt of energy shot up her arms, searing hot. She gasped, nearly pulling away, but her hands refused to budge. Her heart pounded wildly, and she heard an echo like a distant roar in her ears. The swirling floor design glowed with a hellish light. The dragon skulls above her rattled, their jaws widening as if they'd come alive. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the pedestal. The runes glowed red now, then white, then a swirl of color reminiscent of dragon flame. She felt heat racing through her veins, far hotter than any normal flame, but it did not burn her flesh. Instead, it burrowed deep into her soul, peeling back layers of regret, rage, sorrow, ambition. She cried out, uncertain whether in pain or something else. The force that coursed through her seemed to awaken slumbering memories, visions of old Valyria at the height of its glory, illusions of towers shining in the sun, dragons circling overhead in majestic arcs. She saw the forging of living flame, men and women chanting incantations in a tongue older than time. Then everything shifted, the illusions shattered under the cataclysmic force of the doom, towers collapsing into rivers of molten rock, dragons shrieking as the sky tore open, the very earth betraying them. She felt a wave of sorrow so profound it nearly broke her. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she beheld the ruin of her ancestors. Her mind reeled with empathy for their hubris, for the innocents who had perished, for the unstoppable tide of destruction that devoured them. She thought of the civilians in King's Landing, burnt alive under her watch, under her dragon's flame. An anguished cry tore from her throat as she witnessed parallel horrors, the arrogance of Valyria, her own monstrous might. She wanted to wrench herself free, but the magic pinned her there, forcing her to confront these truths. Amid the torrent of images, a voice surfaced in her consciousness, a female voice, echoing as though from a great distance. Blood of the dragon, it intoned, you stand at the crossroads. Will you become the flame that consumes, or the light that guides? Daenerys sobbed, trying to voice an answer. She found no words. Guilt warred with her desire to heal the world. Was there room for both in one heart? The illusions crackled, the swirling energies intensifying around her. She was vaguely aware of Malthero shouting something, but she could not distinguish their words. Then the heat pressed deeper, reaching for the very essence of her being. She felt a scorching in her chest, right where Jon's dagger had pierced her, as though that old wound had become a channel for this new power. It burned, but the pain was tempered by a flicker of promise. If she survived this trial, perhaps she could still shape a better destiny. Clenching her jaw, Daenerys summoned the core of her will. She drew upon every moment of resilience she had ever shown, surviving the Red Waste, crossing the Dothraki Sea, chaining her dragons when they threatened children, enduring betrayals by those closest to her. She called upon her love for those she had lost, Yora, Missandei, Ser Barristan, even the child she had once carried, and fused that love with her fierce desire to protect what remained. And in that reservoir of determination she found a spark that refused to be extinguished, that demanded she keep striving, no matter how many times fate hammered her down. She released that spark into the fiery currents swirling around her. The glow surged, expanding in a thunderous rush. The pedestal vibrated, cracks slithering across the ancient stone, and the floor's metal spiral glowed white-hot. Then, like the breath of a dying storm, the energy snapped back into Daenerys, slamming her with unimaginable force. She was hurled backward, crashing onto the chamber floor, gasping for air as though she had been submerged in deep water. For long moments, she lay stunned, tears drying on her cheeks. Malthero rushed to her side, voice urgent. Daenerys! They cradled her head, checking for injury. She coughed, struggling to speak, her entire body shaking as if an inferno still burned within her. When she finally found her voice, it was hoarse. I'm here. Malthero's gaze flicked to the pedestal. It was shattered now, only fragments of runes remaining. The chamber's glow faded, leaving them with the weak luminescence of Malthero's conjured orb. The spiral on the floor no longer shimmered, it looked dull and dormant, as if the ancient power had been spent in that single, violent moment. Daenerys let out a ragged breath. I saw everything. Memories still crowded her mind, but one insight burned clearly, the knowledge that the old Valyrians had doomed themselves by letting ambition eclipse compassion, by seeking mastery without restraint. She now understood it in a way that only someone who had walked in that same shadow could. I can't let that happen again, she whispered, though she wasn't fully sure what shape that vow would take. Malthero helped her stand, supporting her with an arm around her waist. The power here was half buried, half corrupted by the doom, they said quietly. You've taken some part of it into yourself. It is done. Daenerys steadied herself, heart thrumming with a strange, lingering energy. Indeed, she felt something different. The wound in her chest still ached, but there was a heat radiating behind it, almost comforting. She touched the spot gingerly. I don't know what this means, she confessed. Neither do I, Malthero admitted. But you have awakened something older than the doom. May it guide you. With trembling steps, they made their way back up the winding corridors. Daenerys' mind was aflame with questions. What exactly had she absorbed? Was it some vestige of the old Dragon Lord's power, or the impetus of their downfall? Could she wield it without repeating their sins? She only knew that she felt a stirring, a possibility of forging a new path that might redeem her past mistakes. They emerged into the temple's upper chamber where Drogon was waiting, prowling in anxious circles. The moment he saw Daenerys, he rushed forward, bumping her with his snout in agitation. She tried to reassure him with gentle strokes. It's all right. I'm all right. But the dragon's keen senses must have detected the new, raw magic coiling around her. She could see the confusion in his gaze. In response, she leaned her forehead against his scales. A small warmth pulsed between them, stronger than before, a shared heartbeat of rider and dragon. Drogon rumbled, uncertain, then relaxed incrementally. Outside, the light had taken on the gray pall of evening. A baleful red glow outlined distant spires as volcanic vents belched smoke into the sky. Daenerys looked at the cursed city around her, a graveyard of lost grandeur. She thought of the prophecy that had driven Malthero, of her own uncertain destiny. Perhaps, she mused, Valyria could be reborn in some form, cleansed of the old ways' atrocities. But such a feat would require more than just magic. It would require her own transformation, her willingness to become something different from the conqueror she had been. She turned to Malthero. I need time, she said simply. Time to understand what I am now. To decide what to do with this second chance. Malthero inclined their head. Time is yours, so long as the city's perils do not consume us. We can remain in these ruins for a while longer, though we must be vigilant. There are other creatures here, and other sorcerers, perhaps drawn by the residue of power. A whisper of dread traced along Daenerys' spine. She wondered what manner of beings lurked in the smoking sea, what monstrous creations might still roam these labyrinthine halls. But she nodded. We'll prepare. We'll explore what we can. Then I must decide my course. She paused, eyes distant. I do not know if Westeros has crowned another king or queen. I do not know if my name is cursed or pitted. But one day I may return. Malthero studied her carefully. And if you do, will you seek vengeance? She lowered her gaze. Her emotions roiled at the thought of Jon Snow. Part of her yearned to hate him, to punish him for his betrayal. Another part remembered his grief, his struggle. Vengeance does not undo the past, she whispered finally. I feel sorrow, betrayal, even anger. But I cannot become the very thing I hated. Malthero was silent a moment, then offered a solemn nod. As you will, Dragon Queen. Drogon shifted beside her, letting out a low rumble. She closed her eyes, pressing a hand over her chest, where the echo of the pedestal's power still resonated. In her first life, she had been Daenerys Targaryen, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, aspirant to the Iron Throne, stained by the blood of innocence. In this strange new life, she was a revenant, bound by Valyrian sorcery and uncertain purpose. The city's ghosts pressed in around her, whispering warnings of what happens when ambition is not tempered by compassion. She inhaled the acrid air. Her entire body still felt feverish, but her mind was sharpening. She took a step across the temple floor, her bare feet stirring dust and cinders. We'll need a plan, she said at last. Shelter, supplies, a way to survive. And perhaps, one day, a path to redemption. She let that word hang in the air, uncertain but resolute. Redemption might be an impossible dream, yet the idea of it flickered in her heart like a candle's flame, refusing to be snuffed out by despair. Malthero's expression softened, and they bowed their heads slightly. Drogon exhaled, his breath hot on her shoulder. Daenerys raised her eyes to the distant swirl of fiery clouds over Valyria. She remembered the voice she had heard in the vision, asking if she would be the flame that consumes or the light that guides. She did not have a full answer yet, but she swore to the old gods, the new, and whatever powers lingered in this place, that she would try to be the latter. No matter how jagged the path or how heavy her guilt, she would use her second life to break more chains than she forged, and perhaps, in doing so, break the chains that still shackled her own soul. That night, she dreamt again of running across black fields beneath a red sky, chasing after phantoms of her past. But this time, when she reached the precipice, no monstrous dragon emerged from the chasm. Instead, a faint shimmer of dawn touched the horizon, suggesting that even in the darkest ruin, the promise of a new day might still come. Over the following weeks, Daenerys and Malthero established a sort of existence in the temple. They explored further into the surrounding ruins, scrounging what they could. The city offered little in the way of edible food, but they found a few patches of hardy lichens and underground fungi, and Drogon's hunts provided fresh meat, though Daenerys had to be careful to cook it thoroughly over dragonfire to avoid the toxins that might lurk in the local wildlife. Her wound continued to heal, albeit slowly, and she felt that strange heat in her chest, a remnant of the focusing stone's power. It didn't seem to grant her any obvious new abilities. She couldn't conjure flames at will or raise the dead, but she sensed her bond with Drogon had deepened, and she sometimes heard echoes of his thoughts when he was near. More than once, he seemed to intuit her needs before she spoke them. Malthero observed these changes with a mix of awe and caution. One evening, as ashen twilight settled over broken spires, Daenerys stood at a vantage point atop a crumbling tower. From there, she could see the smoky sea beyond the city's outskirts. The water glowed with an unearthly luminescence, a reflection of the volcanic vents below the surface. The sky above was bruised purple, shot through with streaks of dull crimson. She closed her eyes, letting the wind whip her hair back. She thought of the wide world that lay beyond this cursed peninsula. Essos, Westeros, the Summer Isles, places she had once walked or dreamed of walking. Did news of her death spread across the seas, or did rumor and confusion still linger? She remembered Tyrion's wry counsel, Grey Worm's loyalty, Jon's tormented gaze. All fragments of a life that felt simultaneously recent and long past. A presence joined her. She sensed Malthero's approach before they spoke. "Dragon Queen," they said, voice subdued. "I wonder if you have given thought to your next steps." Daenerys opened her eyes, gazing at the toxic waters. "I have," she murmured. "I want to leave this place eventually. Not yet, but soon. There is nothing here but ghosts and the echo of old sins." Malthero nodded. "Where will you go?" She hesitated, considering. "North, perhaps? To Essos? Or further? Maybe I will seek out the Dothraki Sea again, or Meereen, and see what remains of the city I once ruled. Or maybe I will venture to places unknown to me, far from the Seven Kingdoms." She sighed. "Yet I feel drawn. Part of me thinks I should return to Westeros, if only to find peace with what happened." "Jon Snow," Malthero said simply, as if reading her heart. Daenerys' chest constricted. She did not speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "I loved him in my way. I trusted him. I believed in him. Then he killed me." Her jaw set, tears threatening. "But I can't pretend it never happened. If I ever return, it must be without the thirst for war. I must see what kind of ruler sits the Iron Throne. Maybe that is my penance, to witness the realm thrive without me." Malthero listened quietly. After a pause, they said, "If you desire my help, I will accompany you. My life is bound to yours. And I am curious about the world beyond Valyria." Daenerys offered a faint smile, sorrow tinged with gratitude. "You saved me, Malthero. I won't force you to follow me. But I would welcome a companion." She couldn't imagine facing the world alone, carrying her guilt and the stigma of resurrection. Yes, she had Drogon, but a dragon is still a dragon, bound by different impulses. Another human presence, especially one who understood the nature of her new life, might be a comfort. Malthero inclined their head. "Then we are allied for now." Daenerys turned once more to the black horizon. She recalled the voice in her vision, the question posed. Would she be the flame that consumes or the light that guides? For so long, she had tried to be a liberator, but her path had slipped into something else. Perhaps a second chance could allow her to walk that path more carefully. Though she had no illusions, she was still Daenerys Targaryen, strong-willed, shaped by fire. She would not cower if threatened. Yet maybe she could learn patience, empathy, and measure judgment in ways she had failed to do before. Her mind wandered back to the day she was resurrected, to Drogon's unwavering devotion, to the sacrifice Malthero had made. Somehow, that miracle had cut through the thick veil of hatred and bitterness that might have claimed her spirit had she died unrepentant. She breathed in the acrid wind, quietly thanking fate, or the gods, or whatever force governed the world, for this reprieve. A second life was a rare gift. Perhaps it was also a burden, but one she intended to carry differently than the crown she had once sought at all costs. With nightfall, she and Malthero shared a meal in the temple's courtyard, beneath a broken colonnade where the stars were dimly visible through the haze. The conversation turned to smaller matters: how to reinforce their makeshift shelter, how to avoid certain sections of the city where the fumes were most deadly, how to preserve the fungus they'd gathered. There was a strange intimacy in these mundane concerns, especially when Daenerys remembered ruling in gilded halls, commanding thousands. But in a way, the simplicity was almost restful. No bells told her arrival, no lords and ladies hovered for favors. She was merely a woman who had walked through death and returned, sharing a quiet meal with a mysterious mage in the ruins of her ancestors. At one point, Drogon landed heavily beside them, eyeing the mushrooms skeptically. Daenerys smiled. "I know, it's hardly a feast for you," she teased, tossing him a chunk of leftover meat from his earlier hunt. He snapped it up, tongue flicking out. She stroked his scales, feeling that warm bond pulsing between them. In some strange sense, Drogon was the only family she had left. He had chosen her over everything else, even in the face of heartbreak and betrayal. She pressed her forehead against him, whispering thanks in a voice too low for Malthero to hear. Drogon grumbled softly, as if in acknowledgement. Eventually, Malthero retired to a corner of the courtyard to meditate or pray. Daenerys wasn't certain. She curled beside Drogon, using a folded cloak for a pillow, gazing at the broken arches overhead. Her mind drifted to Jon again, to Tyrion, to Sansa, to Arya, to all the players in the Game of Thrones. They were living out their stories in a land that believed Daenerys Targaryen was gone forever. Would they be relieved she was dead? Would they be haunted by the memory of the Dragon Queen who had arrived to save them from the army of the dead, only to scorch King's Landing? Did they reflect on the choices that led to her downfall, or had they moved on? She thought of how she might reveal herself if she ever returned. Would she arrive in secret, or on Drogon's back in full view of the realm? The notion terrified and thrilled her, but she knew she was not ready. Not yet. There was a journey she had to undertake, both outward and inward, before she could face Westeros again. She had to confront her ghosts, heal more fully, prove to herself that she could be worthy of the mercy she now sought. As the night deepened, her eyes grew heavy. Sleep swept her into another labyrinth of dreams. She walked the streets of Meereen, hearing the cheers of freed slaves, but also the jeers of those who resented her rule. She saw a red comet streak across the sky, just as it had when her dragons were born. She followed the comet and found herself before the throne in the Red Keep, but it was not the Iron Throne. It was forged of black stone and dragon skulls, and the seat was wreathed in flame. A voice called to her from behind the throne, neither male nor female, but powerful. "Rise, Daenerys Stormborn. Rise anew." She woke with a start, heart hammering. Dawn's dim light filtered through the ruined columns. The air was thick with ash, but there was a soft breeze that felt almost refreshing. Malthero was awake, sitting cross-legged in quiet contemplation. Drogon was perched on a toppled statue, scanning the horizon as though on guard. Daenerys ran a hand through her hair, pushing aside the dream's lingering echoes. Each day in Valyria, she felt some subtle shift inside her, as if the power that had reignited her life was slowly taking root. She rose, ignoring the stiffness in her muscles. She knew that if she lingered here forever, she would grow complacent, haunted by the same bleak ghosts that devoured her ancestors. The world was vast, and though she had tasted its horrors, there was still good in it worth saving. She had to see it again to shape her own fate rather than let guilt hold her prisoner. Perhaps she could do better this time. Malthero, sensing her movement, stood and inclined their head. "You seem resolved." Daenerys nodded. "I am. Soon, we'll leave Valyria. I need to return to life to face whatever awaits." She paused, lips pressed tight. "But before we do, I want to pay respects." They understood her meaning. They had spoken of the countless souls lost in the Doom, and also of Daenerys' own family line, Targaryens who had fled to Dragonstone, leaving so many of their kin behind. She could not right all the ancient wrongs, but perhaps she could lay a small token of remembrance in this scorched land. More personally, she needed to close this chapter before starting another. And so, Daenerys retrieved a scrap of cloth she'd kept, one of the only remnants of her old banners. On it was the three-headed dragon sigil of House Targaryen, faded and torn. They traveled a short distance to a high ledge overlooking the molten channels beneath the city. The place stank of brimstone, the ground hot to the touch. There, Daenerys laid the cloth across a jagged stone, weighing it down with a shard from one of Valyria's black towers. She whispered a prayer under her breath. Perhaps no god would hear, but it was as much for her own heart as any deity. She prayed for those lost in Valyria's doom, for those she had lost in her life, for the innocents she had harmed, and for the chance to be something better. When she finished, she rose and stood at the ledge. The sight before her was both terrifying and strangely beautiful, the roiling currents of lava, the swirling smoke, the shards of ancient spires rising like bones. Malthero stood a respectful distance behind her, silent. Drogon landed nearby, the wind of his wings stirring her hair. Daenerys closed her eyes, letting the heat wash over her one last time. Then she turned to Drogon. "Dracarys," she said softly. The dragon unleashed a torrent of fire into the molten depths below, a final salute to the city of her ancestors. The flames mingled with the lava in a ferocious display of incandescent color. When the roar subsided, Daenerys exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She would not forget Valyria or the lessons it taught her, but she would not be a prisoner of it either. She looked at Malthero, who stepped forward. Their hood was drawn, but Daenerys sensed approval. "We can leave when you will," they said. Daenerys nodded. "Tomorrow." She glanced at Drogon, who seemed restless, as though eager to take to the skies and leave this cursed peninsula behind. "We'll fly across the sea. East first? There must be ships in the coastal cities of Essos. We can decide from there." Malthero inclined their head. "Agreed." That final night in Valyria felt like a vigil. Daenerys slept fitfully, torn by excitement and anxiety for the journey ahead. Yet in the morning's pale light, tinged red by the smoky haze, she gathered what supplies they had, including the few relics salvaged from the ruins. An old dagger of Valyrian steel Malthero had found, a couple of battered scrolls that might hold some surviving scraps of knowledge, and a cloak woven from leftover cloth. Malthero had little to carry, having long subsisted in these ruins on meager possessions. Their real treasure was the arcane skill they possessed and the life bond that tied them to Daenerys' fate. Drogon crouched on the temple's shattered dais, wings spread wide. Daenerys climbed onto his back, offering a hand to Malthero. She wasn't entirely sure how Drogon would react to carrying another passenger, but he allowed it. The robed figure settled behind Daenerys, arms tentatively circling her waist. With a snort, Drogon leapt skyward, the force of his wings driving them aloft. The temple fell away beneath them, the labyrinth of blackened rubble shrinking as they rose into the ashen sky. Daenerys looked down one last time at the city that had given her new life. The mosaic courtyards, the caved-in domes, the chasms filled with molten rock, the broken towers that once glimmered with unholy splendor. Somewhere below, the ghosts of her ancestors drifted in eternal lament. She felt a pang of sorrow, but also a tremor of determination. She was not the same woman who had marched on King's Landing with fiery wrath. She carried scars, literal and metaphorical, but also a renewed sense of humility and purpose. That had to be enough. Drogon roared, spitting flame at the billowing clouds. Then he banked sharply, heading east, away from the smoking sea. The wind whipped Daenerys' hair into a silver banner behind her, tears streaming from her eyes as they cut through the sulfur-laden air. She wondered fleetingly if this was how she would be remembered, a broken queen riding a black dragon across forsaken skies. But memory is always shaped by those who remain behind. She could only control what she did with the second life, not how others judged it. As they soared, the city's smoldering silhouette receded, swallowed by distance and shadow. Daenerys felt the chill of higher altitude, and she clutched Drogon's scales. Malthero's arms tightened around her, clinging to the only warmth on that windy flight. She gazed at the horizon where the clouds parted to reveal a glimpse of shimmering sea, calm and endless. Somewhere beyond lay the wide world, replete with wonders and dangers. She had walked its soils in her first life, forging alliances, toppling tyrants, birthing dragons. Now she approached it anew, changed in body and spirit, uncertain but resolute. She let out a breath. A single question echoed in her mind, posed by that mysterious voice in the vision. Will you be the flame that consumes, or the light that guides? She did not claim to know the final answer. But for now, she chose to hope that her resurrection was not a curse, but a chance to right old wrongs and carve a gentler legacy. She chose to live. She would let the rest be decided by her actions in the days and years to come. Beneath her, Drogon surged forward, enormous wings cutting the air. Behind her, Malthero clung like a silent guardian. Beneath them all, the ancient land of Valyria shrank into an ember on the horizon. The wind was cold on Daenerys' face, the taste of salt stronger with each passing minute. She whispered a quiet prayer to the memory of all she had lost and to the boundless unknown that awaited. Then she spurred Drogon onward into the new day, carrying hope and regret in equal measure. She was Daenerys Targaryen, alive once more and determined to face the future with open eyes. Drogon's wings churned the skies with mighty sweeps, carrying Daenerys and Malthero across the smoking sea and away from the haunted peninsula of Valyria. The wind buffeted their faces and the salt spray of distant waves mingled with the lingering taste of ash on Daenerys's lips. She kept her gaze forward, fixing on the pale horizon, though she could not help looking back from time to time at the dark shape behind them. Valyria's broken towers slowly vanished beneath the haze of rising fumes until all that remained was the memory of a cursed land and the faint shimmer of heated air. The flight east offered no gentle respite. Clouds sagged low in the sky, gray and swollen, and the sun itself was often a sullen blot behind them. Daenerys clutched at Drogon's scales, feeling the roiling ache in her chest that pulsed whenever the wind chilled her too deeply. She was still not entirely healed from her mortal wound, even though magic had reignited her lifeblood. Pain spiked through her ribs whenever Drogon dipped or rose too sharply, though she did her best to hide it. Malthero clung just behind her, arms light around her waist, their hood casting a deep shadow over their features. Daenerys could hear their breath at times, labored by the cold air and the drumming force of Drogon's flight. It reminded her that Malthero too had sacrificed vital energy to restore her. They were bound together, precarious travelers riding the back of a dragon over wide waters once believed too cursed for any to cross. By dusk, the shoreline of Essos appeared as a faint smudge against the horizon. Daenerys felt a flutter of relief. She had half expected some new doom to rise from Valyria's depths and drag them into a watery grave. Drogon descended, forging onward with relentless determination, but his muscles quivered with fatigue. He had hunted in Valyria's twisted environs and fed on the strange creatures skulking there, yet the flight was long and exhaustion frayed even a dragon's stamina. Daenerys felt his laboring heartbeat beneath her legs, heard the ragged snorts as he inhaled salted wind. She murmured in his ear, quietly encouraging him to hold fast until they reached land. At last, as night's shadows spread across the sea, Drogon made landfall on a rocky expanse of beach that jutted into the water. Craggy spires lined the coastline, and breakers foamed white around them. He alighted in a swirl of sand and flying pebbles, exhaling a groan that shook his entire frame. Daenerys dismounted, her knees nearly buckling when her feet hit solid ground. Malthero followed, stepping gingerly onto the damp sand. Drogon took a few halting steps, craning his neck this way and that, as though scanning for immediate threats. When he detected none, he hissed softly and folded his wings with a shiver of relief. Daenerys ran a hand along his flank, feeling how hard his muscles quivered. "Rest," she told him, voice throbbing with gratitude. "You've done enough for now." Malthero moved closer, though they kept a respectful distance from Drogon's swinging tail. "He's exhausted," they observed. "We should find shelter and fresh water if we can." Daenerys nodded, ignoring the piercing ache in her ribs. In the dim twilight, the beach looked desolate. A swath of black sand hemmed in by rugged cliffs, the sea pounding ceaselessly behind. She scanned the rock faces that rose near the shore. By the faint glow of moonlight, she spotted something like a cleft in the stone, a possible cave entrance. She drew a breath to steady herself, then gestured for Malthero to follow. The two of them picked a careful path across wet stones, Daenerys pausing every few steps to test the weight on her chest. It was not so debilitating that she could not walk, but she felt the persistent tenderness where Jon's dagger had once ended her life. In a twisted way, the pain reminded her she was, impossibly, still among the living. That knowledge mingled with a swirl of conflicting emotions she could not entirely untangle. Anger at the betrayal, sorrow for what she had lost, and a faint, stubborn hope that somehow she might still do good in this world. They soon reached the rocky outcrop and discovered that the cleft was indeed the mouth of a cave. It was not large. A grown man could stand upright only if he stooped slightly, but it offered enough space to shelter from the cold wind. The sound of dripping water echoed from within. Daenerys and Malthero ventured inside, eyes adjusting to the deeper shadows. With a soft sigh, Daenerys found a thin rivulet that ran down a groove in the stone wall. Catching it in her palms, She tasted it gingerly and found it brackish but ultimately drinkable. Drogon, too large to fit into the cave, remained outside. Daenerys returned to him with a few cupped handfuls of water, letting him lick at the shallow pool in her hands. He swallowed it noisily, snorting at the gritty taste, but he lowered his head for more. She understood his thirst would not be sated by a few mouthfuls, but it was all she could manage. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would find a proper stream or river. Tonight, they had to make do. She and Malthero gathered driftwood from the beach, though much of it was damp and slimy. Daenerys coaxed Drogon into lighting a small patch of it with a flicker of flame, and they carried the sputtering embers back into the cave, where Malthero tended it patiently until a modest fire crackled. The warmth was meager, but enough to dry the air in their cramped shelter. Daenerys sank onto a cool patch of stone, leaning her back against the wall, letting the heat play over her aching limbs. Malthero settled across from her, cross-legged, their face half-lit by the flicker of flames. Outside, she could still hear Drogon shifting around, the scrape of his claws as he found a suitable place to curl up. Neither Daenerys nor Malthero spoke for a while, the hush broken only by the wind outside and the occasional sputter of the damp wood. Daenerys sensed that Malthero, who had lived a solitary existence in Valyria, knew better than to force conversation. She, too, was content to sit in silence, absorbing the reality of their first night free from the cursed land's gloom. She listened to the rhythms of her own breath, the faint gurgle of dripping water, the relentless break of surf beyond the cave. The world felt strangely vast again, as if she had re-emerged from a tomb of nightmares and now had to reorient herself in an unfamiliar life. She let the warmth lull her toward a shallow doze. Her dreams were restless. She saw flashes of her final days in King's Landing, the Iron Throne gleaming in the ashes, Jon's anguished face as he professed love, the fatal betrayal that followed. The memory stirred a swirl of grief and anger that clenched her entire chest. Yet her dream then shifted to a swirl of shapes. Dragons soared against a blazing sky, ephemeral figures chanted in Valyrian, and a woman whose face she could not see spoke words about second chances. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The cave was dark, the fire had dwindled to embers. Malthero was still across from her, seemingly asleep. Daenerys realized she had been trembling. She took a moment to steady her breath, pressing her palms flat against the cool stone beneath her. Dawn was not far off, judging by the faint light that crept along the cave's opening. She rose stiffly, stepping outside into the pale morning glow. Drogon was sprawled near the water's edge, his chest rising and falling in steady, slumbering rhythms. Ahead, the tide had receded slightly, revealing more of the black sand. The air smelled cleaner than that of Valyria, though it retained the brine and tang of seaweed. Daenerys inhaled deeply, letting the breeze wash over her face. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude to any gods that might listen. Another day. She was alive. When she heard footsteps behind her, she turned to see Malthero emerging from the cave, hood drawn up against the morning chill. They inclined their head in greeting. "We survived the night," they said simply. Daenerys nodded, lips curling with the faintest ghost of a smile. "Yes. And now we need a plan. We cannot wander these shores indefinitely. The first real city lies somewhere north or east of here. Perhaps Volantis if we follow the coastline and cross the Rhoyne, though that may be a long distance. Or we might journey inland, seeking a smaller settlement." Malthero considered. "The closer to the coast, the more likely we'll find trading ships, caravans, or villages. But also more eyes to see a dragon overhead. That could cause panic or attract enemies." Daenerys sighed. She had not forgotten how the world responded to dragons. They were both objects of terror and tokens of unimaginable power. "We can keep Drogon out of sight as best we can, perhaps in remote areas, and I can go ahead on foot. But first, we need to see to his needs. A fresh water supply, and game for him to hunt without alarming half the countryside." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "There must be hills or forests beyond these cliffs. If we can find a place for him to hide until nightfall, I can scout ahead. I doubt we'll get far in a day, but at least we'll have a direction." They spent the better part of that morning following the beach and searching for a path that led up the rocky cliff face. Malthero used their unnatural sense, some lingering effect of Valyrian magic, to find a narrow goat trail that wound upward between jagged outcroppings. Drogon followed in short bursts of flight when the trail became too cramped for his bulk. At the top, they emerged onto higher ground. a series of rolling hills mantled with coarse grass, dotted with wind-blown shrubs. The landscape was wild and empty, though Daenerys spotted a flock of small goat-like creatures grazing in the distance. Drogon did too. He snorted eagerly, flames dancing in his nostrils. Daenerys, mindful that a fiery assault might draw attention, beckoned for him to wait. She and Malthero crept forward to assess the area, ensuring there were no herders or watchers. When they saw none, she nodded to Drogon. He took flight, a silent blur of black scales against the pale sky, then dove upon the goats. The herd scattered, bleeding in terror, but Drogon's speed was unmatched. He snatched two in his claws and unleashed a narrow jet of flame to finish them quickly. Daenerys watched with a mixture of relief and unease. Even a simple hunt reminded her of the times she had used Drogon's fire for war. But hunger was hunger. She stood aside and let the dragon feast. Once he had sated himself, they moved on, heading farther from the cliffs until they found a rocky dell nestled between two rises in the terrain. It offered some cover from a distance, though Drogon's presence would never be wholly concealed. Daenerys soothed him with quiet words, stroking the scales under his jaw. "Rest here. If you see anyone approach, hide or fly away. But stay close enough that I can call you." Drogon rumbled, as if to say he understood. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, sharpened by the arcane energies she had absorbed in Valyria. She sensed his agreement in the deep, resonant timbre of his breathing. She and Malthero then set out on foot, scanning for any sign of civilization. The day was gray and cool, the wind stirring the grasses around them. Daenerys suppressed the urge to shiver, remembering the desert heat of the Red Waste and how she had once yearned for shade. Now she would have preferred a warmer sun, but Essos contained every climate imaginable, from burning sands to frozen steppes. She adjusted the makeshift cloak she'd fashioned from cloth salvaged in Valyria, pulling it tighter around her. Malthero moved with a measured pace beside her, silent but alert, their robes swirling around them. After several hours of walking, they encountered a shallow track that might have been an old caravan road, overgrown with weeds. Its direction skewed eastward, so Daenerys and Malthero followed it, hoping it would eventually lead somewhere with people and provisions. Along the way, Daenerys's mind wandered. She wondered how the rest of the world had shifted since her death. Who ruled Meereen now? Did the people there still speak her name with respect? Or had they, too, turned against her memory after hearing of King's Landing's fate? She recalled her triumphal entrance to the city, how she had ended the Great Master's rule and forged a new coalition of freedmen. Yet time and turmoil could overturn even the strongest transformations. She pressed her lips tight, trying not to dwell on regrets. The future was uncertain enough. They paused near midday by a small stream, its waters clear and babbling over smooth stones. Daenerys felt a flood of relief. Here was the fresh water she had longed to find for Drogon. Unfortunately, the area was open and unprotected, a rolling meadow with only a few scattered shrubs for cover. They knelt to drink anyway, and Daenerys refilled a crude water skin she had fashioned from tanned hide. "We'll mark this place in our minds," she said to Malthero. "We can bring Drogon here tonight if we find no other source." Malthero agreed, though the corners of their mouth tightened in a thoughtful expression. "There have been travelers here," they said, pointing to the flattened grass near the bank. Indeed, footprints, booted feet, not just goats or game, marred the ground. "We should be cautious." Daenerys nodded. She could not help remembering the many times she had encountered strangers on the roads of Essos back when she was still forging her legend. Some had been allies, like the freed slaves who flocked to her banner. Others had been enemies, from mercenaries to resentful lords. If any recognized her now, what would they see? A ghost queen? A rumor come to life? She wondered how she would even explain her resurrection. Perhaps denial was simpler. Her hair was still silver white, a striking feature, but if she kept a low profile, she might pass as a wandering exile or a lost Valyrian descendant. The notion unnerved her. She had worn many titles, but never anonymity. They pressed onward, following the faint path as it wound through the hills. By late afternoon, they crested a gentle rise and glimpsed a scatter of structures in the distance, half a dozen huts or cottages built of rough-hewn timber and clay arranged around what looked like a rudimentary well. Smoke curled from a single chimney and a handful of goats milled outside a penned area. Daenerys paused, heart-thudding. Civilization. Small though it was, it represented a crossing of thresholds, her first contact with the living since her resurrection. She glanced at Malthero, who inclined their head as if deferring to her judgment. "Let me go alone," Daenerys said quietly, pulling the cloak's hood up to shadow her face. "A single traveler will draw less suspicion than two strangers in robes. Wait here, watch from a distance if you can, and if trouble stirs, be ready." Malthero's luminous eyes flickered beneath their own hood. "I can hide among the rocks," they murmured. "I will keep my senses tuned to you. If you call, I will come." Daenerys hesitated, recalling the bond they shared, a link that tied their fates together. She had not tested whether they could communicate telepathically, but sometimes she caught flickers of emotion or echoes of thought, so perhaps it was possible. "I'll try to reach out if I must," she said. "But hopefully these folk will not be dangerous. They look like farmers or herders, not bandits." Still, she felt a tug of nerves as she descended the slope, keeping her posture humble, her hood low. Her chest tightened with each step as though her body feared the moment of discovery. She reminded herself that she was not the conqueror storming a city. She was merely one woman in need of a conversation, some food, maybe a spare garment. She reached the outskirts of the cottages at twilight. The goats in the pen bleated, stirring restlessly at her presence. A wiry dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Light glimmered through the crooked windows of the nearest house. Daenerys paused at a respectful distance and called out in the common tongue. "Hello? I mean no harm." The dog's barking intensified. A moment later, the door to the cottage opened, revealing a stocky woman with deep lines in her face. She carried a wooden cudgel, eyes narrowed. Another figure, a taller man with a short beard, appeared beside her, brandishing a crude spear. Daenerys' heart pounded, but she kept her hands raised. "I'm only a traveler," she said, trying to mask her accent. "I've been on the road, and I'm hungry. May I speak with you?" The two exchanged a wary glance. Then the man snapped something in a local dialect. Daenerys caught only half the words, though she recognized some Essos phrases. He was asking who she was and what she wanted. She answered softly, "Just shelter. My name is Silver." The choice sprang to her tongue, a half-truth referencing the color of her hair. "I come from the west and lost my companions. I have nothing to trade, but I can work for some bread and water." The woman with the cudgel inspected Daenerys from head to toe. By luck or design, Daenerys' cloak concealed most of her distinctive features, though her silver hair still caught the evening's dim light. The couple seemed uncertain, but eventually the bearded man lowered his spear a fraction. "You're not from near here, that's plain enough, but we've nothing to spare. Times are hard." Daenerys offered a short nod, taking a calculated risk by stepping closer to the firelight spilling from their door. She tried to keep her eyes downcast. "Please, just a crust of bread and perhaps a place by the fire for a single night. Then I'll go." The woman studied her more closely, eyes flicking over the slimness of her frame, the dryness of her lips. Daenerys did not have to feign weariness. She felt it in her bones. Perhaps pity stirred. The woman grunted. "We'll see what we can spare, but mark me, no trouble. If you bring trouble here, you'll regret it." Daenerys raised her palms again in a gesture of peace. "No trouble." The man beckoned her inside. The cottage's interior was cramped and dim. A low fire guttered in a small hearth, casting flickering shadows across rough stone walls. A pot of something that smelled like onions and thin broth simmered. The dog that had been barking outside slunk in behind them, eyeing Daenerys suspiciously. Two small children peeked around a corner, wide-eyed. The woman hissed at them to stay back, then turned to Daenerys. "Sit. I'll fetch you something." She jerked her chin at a wooden stool near the hearth. Daenerys nodded in gratitude, carefully lowering herself. Her chest gave a stab of protest, but she disguised it, schooling her expression into a mask of mild fatigue. The man remained standing, hand tight on his spear. He wore rough homespun clothes, patched at the elbows. Dirt stained his hands, and Daenerys guessed they were goat herders. eking out a living in this remote region. The woman ladled a portion of the broth into a chipped bowl and handed it to Daenerys, who accepted it with quiet thanks, though she could scarcely contain her hunger. The first sip tasted like heaven, despite being watery and undersalted. She forced herself to eat slowly, not wanting to appear desperate or ill. The dog edged closer, sniffing her boots. Daenerys extended a cautious hand for it to smell, remembering how she had once tried to show gentleness to frightened beasts. The dog did not growl, so she relaxed a fraction. She looked up at the couple, studying them in turn. The woman had a scar on her left cheek and her hair was pinned back in a messy knot. The man's beard was streaked with gray. Tension pulled at their features. These were not trusting times, apparently. She cleared her throat softly. "You live alone here, with your children?" she asked, trying to sound conversational. "Yes," the man answered curtly, not offering more detail. After a moment, the woman spoke as if to smooth over the man's abruptness. "A few other families are scattered in the hills. Sometimes we trade among ourselves. Not many travelers pass this way. The war in the west drove refugees across Essos, but that was some time ago." Daenerys's pulse quickened at the mention of the war in the west. She had no idea how the common folk here viewed the events in Westeros. She lowered her gaze, stirring the broth. "I heard rumors. Something about a mad queen burning the city. And a new king crowned after. Is that what you've heard?" The woman shrugged. "That's talk from the other side of the sea. None of us pay it much mind. The only concern we have is feeding ourselves." She paused, eyeing Daenerys warily. "You're from Westeros, though, aren't you? I hear the accent." Daenerys chose her next words carefully. "I came from there, yes, but not recently. I've been roaming for a long time." She kept her tone neutral, betraying neither pride nor apology. The man snorted as if that satisfied his curiosity. He leaned his spear against the wall, but did not stray far from it. The woman, apparently deciding Daenerys was no imminent threat, looked to the children hiding behind the corner and nodded. Slowly, they emerged. One was a girl of about 8, the other a younger boy. They gazed at Daenerys with wide, curious eyes. She offered them the gentlest smile she could muster. "Hello," she said, but the children only stared. The boy clutched the girl's arm protectively. Daenerys finished the broth in silence. The warmth pooled in her belly, chasing away the day's chill. She exhaled a soft sigh. It was a simple comfort, the sort she had rarely experienced in her old life of war councils and palatial enclaves. Outside, the light was fading fast. The woman handed Daenerys a hunk of bread, coarse and dense, then jerked her head toward a corner near the hearth. "You can sleep there, but if you try any thievery, you'll regret it." Daenerys understood their suspicion. Strangers could bring violence or theft, especially in a harsh land. She nodded. "Thank you. In the morning, I'll be on my way." She kept her eyes respectfully lowered, trying not to draw more scrutiny. It was strange to be so near to ordinary folk who had no inkling that she was Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, returned from death. Part of her felt almost relieved at the anonymity, even if it was built on half-truths. Night deepened and the family retreated to a separate corner, presumably to their own bedding. The dog curled by the door, occasionally lifting its head to watch Daenerys. She found a spot on the floor near the hearth, using her folded cloak as a pillow. Exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, but her mind whirled. Where was Malthero now, hidden among the rocks? She presumed they were somewhere outside, keeping watch. She hoped they were safe. In a moment of reflection, she realized she was also grateful that no one here had recognized her face or name. These people had offered her a measure of kindness, meager as it was, with no demands for favors or vengeance. If they knew who she truly was, would they recoil in terror? Would the children scream at the memory of hearing about a queen who burned a city to ash? She turned onto her side, wincing at the flare of pain in her chest. A pang of longing for simpler times spiked inside her. Memories of the warm plains in her early days among the Dothraki, before the weight of prophecy and ambition had settled fully upon her shoulders. Memories of Ser Jorah protecting her, Missandei's gentle presence. She remembered how once she had been so young and open-hearted. A tear slid across her cheek, quickly lost in the dimness. She closed her eyes, letting the pop of the dying fire lull her to uneasy rest. At some point in the small hours of the night, she stirred, feeling a jolt in her spirit. Panic flared without warning, a sense that something was amiss. She sat up, heart hammering, and realized she was not alone in that moment. A shape crouched by the door, hooded and lean. Malthero. Their eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, reflecting the last embers of the hearth. Daenerys tensed, glancing at the sleeping family, but none seemed to have awakened. Malthero inclined their head in silent greeting. How they had entered without rousing the dog was beyond Daenerys, but she suspected magic was at play. She rose gingerly, edging closer, keeping her footsteps light. The dog remained in a deep sleep or an unnatural trance. Malthero leaned in to whisper, their voice barely audible. "We should go." Riders approached from the east, perhaps a dozen. They bear torches. I saw them crossing the hills. Alarm jolted through Daenerys. A group of a dozen riders with torches at night usually meant some manner of patrol or marauders. These farmers might be in danger if confronted. She glanced at the sleeping couple and their children. Should she warn them? Part of her argued that if she alerted them, they might want to flee or they might blame her for bringing trouble. Yet if raiders were indeed on the approach, it was cruel to slip away without a warning. She touched Malthero's sleeve. "Wait." Then she moved to the sleeping couple kneeling by their side. "Wake," she hissed quietly. "There are riders nearby." The woman jerked awake, eyes wild, and the man sprang up at once, grabbing his spear. Before they could protest, Daenerys continued, "We must be ready. If these riders bring danger, we should not be caught unawares." The man's face darkened. "You brought them," he accused, voice rising in anger. The dog woke then, barking hysterically at Malthero's cloaked figure by the door. "Quiet," Daenerys hissed, heart racing. "I didn't bring them. My companion saw them crossing the hills. I came here alone, but we must prepare." Malthero raised a hand, murmuring something that made the dog whimper and cower. Daenerys swallowed her unease. The woman quickly shushed the children, ushering them to a corner. The man glowered at Daenerys, clearly torn between anger and caution. "How many riders?" Malthero answered in a low voice, 12, perhaps. "Armed. They carry torches, which suggests no friendly errand at this hour." The woman cursed under her breath. "Could be slavers. Raiders sometimes come up from the southern coasts, snatching folk they can sell." Daenerys felt a rush of disgust. Despite her efforts to abolish slavery in some parts of Essos, it remained entrenched in many territories. Her stomach twisted. "What do you normally do in such a situation?" The man's grip on his spear whitened. "If we have time, we run, hide in the hills. Or fight if cornered, though we seldom stand a chance." He eyed Daenerys suspiciously. "You can fight, stranger?" Memories of battles flared in Daenerys's mind, but she only nodded. She did not want to reveal her full power just yet or mention the presence of a dragon. Even if she led Drogon to defend these farmers, the spectacle might cause more chaos. But she could not walk away and let these people be slaughtered or enslaved. She was Daenerys Targaryen, once a breaker of chains. That part of her still lived, no matter her guilt. She turned to Malthero, her voice quiet. "Go back outside. Keep watch. If the riders come here, I'll handle it." She glanced at the man. "If you want to gather your family and hide, do so quickly. Or if you choose to stand your ground, do so with caution." The woman swore again, then nodded resolutely. "We'll hide the children in the root cellar behind the cottage. We've only our old weapons, but we'll do what we must." In the flurry of alarm, no one questioned Malthero's ghostly presence or the fact that the dog now quivered on the ground. The couple roused the children, guiding them quietly to a small hatch in the back. The dog followed. Daenerys caught the younger boy's terrified expression and her heart clenched. She remembered the frightened gazes of children in battle-torn cities. Once she had tried to spare them all. Look what became of that dream. She forced her attention to the immediate threat. Malthero slipped outside, melting into the darkness. Daenerys threw off her cloak, preparing for whatever confrontation might come. The man at her side trembled slightly, spear clenched, while the woman hefted her cudgel and stood near the doorway. Silence stretched, broken only by the frantic beating of Daenerys' heart. Had she truly believed she could hide from conflict in some quiet corner of Essos? Trouble found her as naturally as breath. She braced herself, recalling the fighting skills she had gleaned through necessity, though she was no swords master. And she lacked a proper weapon beyond a knife at her belt. Minutes ticked by. Daenerys wondered if the riders might pass without noticing the cottages. Then came the distant thud of hooves. She heard muffled voices speaking a dialect she only half recognized. Torchlight flickered through the cracks in the shutters. A horse snorted. The lead rider barked a command and the hoofbeats halted just outside. Daenerys' pulse thundered in her ears. A heavy knock rattled the door. "Open up," a man's voice demanded in common tongue, thick with a slurred accent. The man hammered again. "We see your light. Don't make us break it down." The man with the spear glanced at Daenerys, panicked. She swallowed, stepping to the door, ignoring the throbbing ache in her chest. She called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" "Open this cursed door and we'll tell you," came the reply. Another voice muttered something in the background, and the first speaker snarled as if threatening violence. Daenerys closed her eyes for a heartbeat, considering. If she opened the door, these intruders might charge in. If she refused, they might set the cottage aflame or break in forcibly. Neither outcome appealed. Gathering her courage, she lifted the wooden latch. The door swung open. Outside, torchlight flared, revealing several mounted figures with swords and axes strapped to their belts. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head, sneered down at her from horseback. He held a torch high in one hand, a curved sword in the other. The gloom behind him was filled with silhouettes of riders, perhaps more than a dozen, all bristling with weapons. Daenerys forced her expression into one of guarded calm. She knew she looked small, unarmed, perhaps not the threat they might fear. "We have little to spare," she said, voice firm. "If you want food, we've none left." The shaved-headed man laughed, a cruel, rasping sound. But we're not here for bread. We want bodies. There's a ship leaving from the coast in 3 days, bound for the fighting pits in Slavers Bay. We gather strong backs to fill its hold." He gestured at the cottages. "Now stand aside, or we'll make you wish you had." A wave of revulsion rolled through Daenerys. She had promised herself that no more would be enslaved if she could help it. But she was only one woman with a single dagger. Could she truly fight them off without Drogon's help? She glanced into the darkness behind the riders, wondering where Malthero lurked. If Malthero used their sorcery, it might reveal them as well. Yet Daenerys could feel the old righteous fury stirring in her veins, tempered by the memory of her darkest mistakes. She inhaled sharply. The slaver dismounted in a fluid motion, stepping closer, sword angled toward Daenerys' chest. "Move," he commanded. She did not budge, though every instinct told her to step back. She heard the man with the spear shift behind her, trying to muster courage. The rider scowled. "Who are you, anyway? You don't look like these hill rats." He raised the torch, illuminating Daenerys' face. His gaze snagged on her silver-white hair, visible in the flickering glow. Daenerys' heart jolted. Would he recognize her? She was rumored dead in Westeros, but the news might not have fully permeated Essos. Her face had once been on the lips of countless freed slaves and fearful slave merchants. She forced a harsh glare. "I'm no one. I won't let you harm these people." He blinked, confusion flickering across his features. He opened his mouth to spit a retort, but before he could speak, Malthero emerged from the darkness behind him, as silent as a wraith. The slaver sensed movement and spun, torch guttering, but Malthero was already raising a pale hand. A word hissed from their lips, sibilant and low. Daenerys saw a faint gleam of greenish light swirl in the space between them. The slaver choked, eyes going wide, as though an invisible force had clamped around his throat. An uproar erupted among the riders. Several dismounted, brandishing weapons. One hurled a torch at Malthero, but Daenerys lunged, knocking it aside with her forearm. Sparks scattered, singing the cloth of her cloak. The man with the spear emerged behind her, thrusting it awkwardly at another attacker. A seal. Ong of steel followed, though the farmer was outmatched in skill. Daenerys reacted on instinct, drawing her dagger and slashing at the rider's arm. The man bellowed in pain, dropping his sword. Another slaver tackled Daenerys, grappling her around the waist. She cried out as agony flared in her chest. Her wound still throbbed with unhealed intensity. Anger coursed through her, accompanied by a strange surge of heat under her ribs. She mustered all her strength and drove her dagger into the man's side. He hissed in surprise, loosening his grip, and she twisted free, stumbling onto the sandy ground outside the cottage. The other riders fanned out, some brandishing crossbows. Torchlight danced across the yard, revealing frantic shadows as the confrontation escalated into chaos. Daenerys spun, looking for Malthero. She found them standing near the shaved-headed slaver, who was still pinned by whatever spell Malthero had cast. His face was contorted with fear. But 2 more raiders closed in on Malthero's flank, swords raised. Daenerys shouted a warning, but before she could reach them, one brought his blade down. Malthero dodged aside with uncanny grace, sliding backward in a swirl of black robes. A flick of their wrist unleashed a spark of ephemeral light that sent the assailant staggering back, coughing. The other raider lunged. Malthero tried to pivot, but not quickly enough. The sword's edge caught their shoulder, raking down with a wet slash. A cry tore from Malthero's lips, and Daenerys felt a simultaneous jolt of white-hot pain in her own chest, as if the wound had been struck there. She gasped, dropping to one knee, confusion swirling. Their life forces were bound. Any harm to Malthero echoed within her. She forced herself up, ignoring the wave of dizziness, and flung her dagger at the raider who had wounded Malthero. It flew wide, grazing the man's arm rather than striking him square. He snarled and turned, eyes glinting with malice. A thunderous roar shattered the night air. Daenerys' heart soared and froze at once. Drogon. The black shadow descended from the sky, eyes blazing with fury. He crashed into the yard, sending a terrified horse reeling. The slavers recoiled, some shouting curses, others stumbling to get out of the way. Drogon's jaws parted in a roar that shook the ground, and a lance of flame spewed forth, incinerating one of the raiders who did not dodge fast enough. Screams echoed. Horses bolted. Pandemonium erupted. Daenerys staggered toward Malthero, ignoring the chaos. She saw the slash across their shoulder, dark blood staining black robes. Malthero's face was contorted with pain, sweat beading on their brow. Their eyes were ringed with that eerie phosphorescence as they struggled to maintain their sorcery. The shaved-headed slaver, released from the binding, collapsed in a fit of choking coughs. Daenerys, near-blinded by her own blossoming ache, clenched her teeth. She had no time to weigh the consequences. Drogon would not hold back. He was furious and protective, responding to her distress. The man with the spear, the farmer, gaped at the sight of a dragon rampaging through his front yard. "Gods preserve us," he whispered, face going ashen. Daenerys had no breath to explain, no moment to calm him. She caught Malthero under the arm, dragging them away from the immediate melee. Drogon's massive form spun, tail lashing out, scattering slavers like rag dolls. Two attempted to flee on horseback, but Drogon spat flame in their path. One horse reared, throwing its rider, while the other galloped madly into darkness. Within seconds, half the raiders were either engulfed in flame or fleeing in disarray. The shaved-headed man, coughing and trembling, scrambled to his feet, sword forgotten. He tried to run, but Drogon's gaze snapped to him. Daenerys saw her dragon coil, jaws parting for another inferno. The man stumbled. Daenerys's heart pounded. She remembered the chaos in King's Landing, the smell of burning flesh. She had sworn not to repeat that horror blindly. Yet this man was a slaver, come to chain innocence. Her thoughts whirled in the space of a breath. The man locked eyes with Daenerys, fear twisting his features. "Mercy," he croaked, raising empty hands. "Please." Drogon's roar filled her ears, and the world seemed to slow. She could let him burn this man alive, as he had the others. The man had threatened them, intended to sell them into misery. Still, a tremor of recognition coursed through her. The line between justice and cruelty was razor thin. Did she have it in her to stay Drogon's fury? For an instant, she was paralyzed by indecision. Then her chest flared with pain, and she remembered the vow she had murmured in Valyria, that if she were given a second life, she would not be the flame that consumes, but a light that guides. She forced herself to act. "Drogon, to me!" she commanded, voice raw. She poured all her will into that call, channeling the bond she felt in her bones. Drogon hesitated, jaws still parted, the flames building in his throat. She shouted again, "No!" The shaved-headed man cowered, anticipating an inferno. But Drogon, with a rumbling snarl, turned his head aside, releasing the torrent of flame harmlessly into the sky. The man collapsed, sobbing with relief. Daenerys's entire body shook with adrenaline and pain. She half-carried, half-dragged Malthero away from the fire-lit chaos. The farmer was nowhere to be seen, perhaps having fled or taken cover. Smoke choked the air. The ground was littered with charred corpses and scattered gear. A few survivors crawled or staggered away in the darkness, moaning in terror. Daenerys had no sympathy for them. She was simply grateful the mayhem was ending. Drogon let out a final roar, as if warning the rest to leave or face his wrath. The surviving horses galloped off into the hills, their riders clinging on for dear life. The shaved-headed man remained near the cottage, hands over his head, trembling. Daenerys saw the reflection of flames dancing in his terrified eyes. She thought momentarily of her father, the Mad King, who relished burning his enemies. She shuddered, stepping closer. With halting steps, she seized the man's sword from the ground and pressed its tip against his throat, her own breath ragged. "You would have stolen these people's freedom," she rasped. "You would have condemned them to chains. There was a time when I would have answered that with fire." She paused, feeling the weight of everything she had done in the name of a better world. "Go," she said at last, "and don't return. If I ever learn you're slaving again," she trailed off, letting the threat speak for itself. She lowered the sword. The man, terrified beyond reason, nodded frantically and scrambled away, stumbling over smoking debris. Daenerys let him go. She sheathed the sword in her belt with trembling hands, then turned to check on Malthero, who gasped in pain, clutching their shoulder. "Let me see," Daenerys murmured, sinking down beside them. Her own chest burned in sympathy, the bond punishing her for Malthero's wound. Blood soaked the robes. "Lie still." Malthero's eyes were half-lidded, their breath shallow. "It's deep," they whispered. "But not mortal." Daenerys exhaled shakily. The wound had to be cleaned, bandaged, or it might fester. She remembered how, in her early days with Khal Drogo, a seemingly minor wound had proven deadly when infection took hold. Summoning every ounce of composure, she looked around for supplies. The cottage door was half-torn from its hinges. The family was nowhere in sight, presumably hiding in the root cellar. She could not blame them if they never wanted to show themselves again. Flames smoldered in patches where Drogon's fire had ignited the ground or bits of thatched fencing. A wave of sorrow washed through her at the devastation, though she reminded herself these were slavers, not innocents. She rummaged in her pouch for a scrap of cloth that might serve as a bandage. She soaked it in a bucket of water near the door, then gently pressed it to Malthero's wound. They hissed, arching their back. Daenerys' own wound throbbed, tears springing to her eyes. She clenched her jaw, cleaning away the blood as best she could in the flickering torchlight that remained. Drogon prowled around them, occasionally emitting low rumbles. The stench of burnt flesh was thick. At last, Daenerys fashioned a makeshift bandage, tying it around Malthero's upper arm and shoulder. Her fingers trembled at the memory of how Missandei had once aided her with gentleness. If only Missandei were here now. When she finished, Malthero's breathing had steadied slightly, though their face was drawn with pain. Daenerys found a rag of water for them to drink, then sagged back, pressing a hand to her throbbing chest. She tasted copper in her mouth as if the bond's sympathetic pain were eating away at her. Drogon let out a soft growl, pushing his enormous head near Daenerys' shoulder. She stroked him, closing her eyes to steady the swirl in her head. Movement to her left made her tense. The farmer emerged from behind the cottage, spear still in hand. He took in the carnage with wide, fearful eyes, then his gaze fell on Drogon. Daenerys rose unsteadily, stepping between them. "We're not here to harm you," she said. "I'm sorry if this brought destruction to your home." The man's mouth worked silently. His eyes flicked to Malthero's blood-stained form, then to the piles of charred bodies. At last, he stammered, "You have a dragon." "I do," Daenerys replied, voice tight. "He saved your life tonight, though the cost was high." A shadow crossed the man's features. He lowered his spear. You can't stay here. This place is ruined." Indeed, the fence was ablaze, the yard torn up by Drogon's claws. "My family will leave at first light, find somewhere else." He swallowed hard. "I don't know who you truly are, but thank you, I suppose." Daenerys nodded, understanding the mixture of gratitude and fear that colored his tone. "Will you take some provisions and go?" "I won't stop you. The slavers who survived have fled. They won't return tonight." He nodded shakily, clearly wanting nothing more than to vanish from this nightmare. Daenerys stepped aside, allowing him to hurry to the root cellar and retrieve his wife and children. They emerged warily, eyes flicking to Drogon in open terror. The younger child whimpered at the sight of the dragon's hulking shape. The woman looked at Daenerys with an expression of numb shock. Daenerys opened her mouth to apologize, but the words stuck. She saw in the woman's eyes a reflection of all the horrors Daenerys had once unleashed. Instead, she bowed her head. "I hope you find safety," she murmured. Then she turned away, returning to Malthero's side. The family gathered their meager belongings in a tattered cart, harnessed it to the one surviving goat, and left quickly, not daring to linger. Within minutes, their shapes vanished into the gloom, the children's quiet sobs echoing on the night wind. Daenerys was left alone with Malthero, Drogon, and the stench of death. Flickers of flame still licked at the broken fence. Her chest felt hollow, weighed down by exhaustion and guilt. She slid a palm across Malthero's brow, feeling the feverish heat that signaled shock and pain. Malthero peered at her through half-closed eyes. "We must depart," they managed. "Others might come." Daenerys nodded. The slavers who escaped would likely spread rumors of a silver-haired woman and a dragon. That was the last thing she wanted if she hoped to remain inconspicuous. "We'll fly," she said, wincing at the thought of traveling in the dark. But they had no choice. She helped Malthero onto Drogon's back, then hoisted herself up, ignoring her own throbbing injuries. Drogon, as if sensing the urgency, launched into the sky, beating his wings in powerful strokes. Below, the smoldering farm receded into darkness, a smear of orange glow against the blackened hills. Daenerys pressed her face to Drogon's scales, fighting tears. She had tried to show mercy, tried not to let the flames consume everything. Perhaps that was progress, but it still felt like the world was stained by her presence. They flew for an hour, maybe longer, across rolling terrain where no lights shone. Eventually, Daenerys spotted a cluster of boulders near a shallow ravine. There, she directed Drogon to land, hoping the rocks would provide enough shelter for them to tend Malthero's wound. When they touched down, she nearly collapsed with weariness, stumbling as she dismounted. Drogon knelt to the ground, allowing Malthero to slide off more gently, though they hissed at the jolt. Daenerys gathered stones to form a small fire circle, coaxing Drogon to unleash a careful gust of flame on dried brush she'd collected. Soon, a fire crackled, casting wavering shadows. She knelt beside Malthero, peeling back the makeshift bandage to inspect the gash. Blood had clotted, but the edges were raw and Daenerys worried about infection. She used a corner of cloth dipped in water from the stream's canteen to clean away fresh grime. Malthero flinched, jaw tight. "Hold on," Daenerys murmured, voice strained with sympathy. "I'll do what I can." She wished she had the skill of a maester, or even the meager healing knowledge of her once companions. It occurred to her that Malthero might know arcane ways to heal themselves, but they seemed too weak to attempt anything more advanced. The drainage of life force from their resurrection bond, the wound, and the exertion of magic all conspired to sap them thoroughly. When she finished cleaning and rebandaging as best she could, Malthero let out a ragged breath, managing a wan smile. "You must also rest. Your wound troubles you." Daenerys touched her chest, feeling the old scar's burning ache. "I'll manage." She noticed Malthero's gaze flick over her with concern. The bond must let them sense her own strain, just as she had felt their pain. She exhaled. "Sleep. I'll keep watch." The night sky spread overhead, velvet dark, studded with stars. Drogon curled around them, tail shifting occasionally, his eyes half-lidded but alert. Daenerys sat cross-legged, hugging her knees to her chest. Weariness seeped into her limbs, but her mind remained ablaze with thoughts. The short skirmish had dredged up all the old questions about power, justice, and mercy that once haunted her steps. Could she walk this precarious path without falling again into violence and destruction? She gazed at the sleeping form of Malthero. They had bound themselves to her fate, for better or worse. Though the cost was steep, she was grateful for their presence. Drogon let out a low rumble, and she rested a hand on his flank, feeling his warmth. Her dragon, her last remaining child. He had seen her at her worst. He had also saved her from the jaws of death. A cold breeze rustled the sparse grass, whispering through the stone pillars. Daenerys lifted her eyes to the stars, recalling how once, in her youth, she believed her destiny was written across the heavens. She had soared high on ambition and had crashed in flames. Now she was merely a wanderer, trying to pick her way through the aftermath. Yet she was alive, granted a chance few ever received. That alone was a miracle she could not take lightly. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and her head lolled. She dozed fitfully, roused occasionally by Drogon's shifting. Once she thought she heard hoofbeats in the distance, but they faded away. Dawn came in a slow crawl of pale light across the horizon. When Daenerys woke fully, her neck was stiff and her muscles ached, but the immediate danger had passed. Malthero still breathed steadily, though their wound remained a concern. Daenerys rose, cradling her ribs as she walked a short distance from the camp to see if she could find a better source of water. The ravine offered a trickle, little more than a muddy seep, but she gathered what she could in the canteen. She also found a handful of edible roots by examining the local plants. Years of living on the road had taught her to identify certain tubers that were safe to cook. It was a meager breakfast, but better than nothing. She returned, rekindled the fire, and set the roots to roast on a flat stone. Their aroma was earthy, if not appealing. Malthero stirred, sitting up with a grimace. "How do you feel?" Daenerys asked softly, kneeling beside them. "Weak," they admitted, adjusting the bandage. A spot of blood had seeped through, but it seemed stable. "But alive." Daenerys managed a small, tight smile. "Alive is enough." She helped them drink some water, then offered a piece of roasted root. "Eat. It will give you strength." Malthero ate slowly, face unreadable beneath the cowl, though they winced when moving their injured arm. After they had finished, Daenerys took stock of their situation. They had few supplies, no reliable allies in this region, and now their presence and Drogon's was likely known to at least a handful of scattered survivors from last night's skirmish. Slavers might regroup or spread word that a dragon roamed these hills. That would draw sellswords, opportunists, or worse. She recalled the idea of traveling to a more populous city like Volantis or Meereen, but in their current state, such a journey could be fraught with peril. Malthero's wound needed proper tending, and Daenerys was still weakened by her own half-healed scar. Furthermore, Drogon's presence made traveling discreetly nearly impossible. Yet they could not linger forever in these lonely hills, scavenging roots and dirty water. The region had proven no safer than any other. Daenerys sighed, pressing a hand to her forehead. "We need to move, but carefully," she said to Malthero. "We might find a healer in a larger town or an apothecary. Someone who can treat your wound. But the risk of being discovered grows the more populated the area." Malthero's eyes glowed faintly in the morning light. "We cannot do this alone for long. You once had armies, loyal advisors. If you intend a different path now, you still need allies, or at least help." Daenerys' heart twisted. She recalled Grey Worm, the Unsullied, the Dothraki, the men and women who had pledged themselves to her cause. She had used them in her war, and in the end, she had left them with little but grief and confusion. "I don't know if any of them remain loyal," she murmured, "or if they would welcome me after everything that happened." Malthero inclined their head. "There may be some who would aid you, not from loyalty to your past cause, but from the memory of what you once did in liberating slaves. Some might remember you as the breaker of chains, not the queen of ashes." Daenerys winced at the mention of that epithet. She knew the world was never so simple. Every deed she had done existed in the tangle of a complicated legacy. Still, the thought that someone out there might remember her earlier triumphs stirred an ache of longing. "Perhaps. But I cannot simply march into a city with a dragon at my side announcing I've returned from death." Malthero's lips curved in a wry twist. "It would make for a dramatic entrance." She almost laughed. "I think I've had enough drama for one lifetime. Or two." Her gaze swept over Drogon, who was lazily surveying the ravine, no doubt hungry again. They needed safer territory, somewhere remote but with enough resources to heal and plan. The memory of the Dothraki Sea flickered in her mind. Endless grasslands, roving Khalasars. She had once found sanctuary among them, though she had also encountered danger. "We might head northeast," she said slowly. "Toward the plains. The Dothraki Sea is vast, but it offers less risk of IMM. Any conflict if we avoid the larger Khalasars." Malthero tilted their head. "You believe that will be safer than crossing near Volantis or heading for Meereen?" Daenerys considered. Meereen held old alliances and old grudges. She had left Daario Naharis in command there, albeit with the Council of Freedmen. But Daario had been her lover, left behind for what she once considered a grander purpose in Westeros. Would he even greet her kindly, or resent her for abandoning him and the city? And would the city's ruling council accept her, given the rumors that might have reached them about her final campaign? The risk felt staggering. Volantis, by contrast, was a bastion of the old slave-holding aristocracy. While it was a major port with healers, trade, and anonymity in the teeming crowds, it was also rife with those who despised her. She recalled that the priestesses of Lawler had once welcomed her, but she could not be sure that courtesy would remain. Everything she had done in Westeros might have changed their stance. Moreover, if news spread of her presence, slavers or bounty hunters could descend upon her swiftly. The Dothraki Sea, though harsh, was wide and open, with fewer prying eyes. Drogon could hunt freely, and they might find small tribes or outliers who either had never heard of her or still revered the mother of dragons from her time as the Khaleesi of a Khalasar. Yes, it was a risk, but so were all roads. She decided with a soft nod, "I think we should try for the Dothraki Sea. At least for a while. I know the grasses and the ways of survival there. And Drogon will not want for game." Malthero accepted this with a grave look. "Then let us gather strength, and we'll depart once I can move more freely." Daenerys spent the next few days tending to Malthero's wound, hunting what she could, and sending Drogon to scout for water sources or small game. They remained near the ravine, hidden among the rocks, traveling short distances at dawn or dusk to avoid detection. Several times, Daenerys heard riders in the distance and quickly hid, heart hammering with the memory of that night's chaos. But the riders never came near enough to discover them, and Drogon wisely stayed out of sight until they passed. Malthero gradually regained some of their strength, though the wound continued to sap them. The sympathetic pain in Daenerys' chest subsided to a dull ache. She had to carefully pace herself as every exertion threatened to reopen her own half-healed scar. By the fifth day, Malthero could mount Drogon again with only minimal help, though they still winced whenever they lifted their injured arm. Daenerys loaded what meager supplies they had onto Drogon's back, tying them in place with strips of cloth. They had managed to scrape together a few items: a salvaged sword from the slavers, a bag of roasted tubers, a small pouch of herbs that might help stave off infection. It was not much, but it would have to do. At dawn, they took flight, heading northeast. The sky was tinted pink by the rising sun, wisps of cloud drifting across an otherwise brightening expanse. Beneath them, the land gave way to gentler hills, then broader plains with the occasional stony outcrop. Daenerys felt a swirl of memories, how she had once crossed these regions with Khal Drogo, forging the path that would eventually lead her toward a destiny she believed was set. Now she was returning in the strangest of circumstances, uncertain of who she was or what she sought. But at least the wide sky offered a sense of openness, a break from the constant fear of lurking watchers. Drogon flew for hours, guided by the sun and the familiar sense of eastward drifting. Daenerys clung to him, body buffeted by the wind, occasionally shouting back to Malthero to ensure they still held firm. Each time she looked over her shoulder, she saw Malthero's face tight with discomfort, but they nodded, pressing on. Below, the terrain began to flatten, the grass turning a golden green. Herds of wild horses roamed in the distance, tiny specks from their vantage in the sky. Some parted in alarm when the shadow of a dragon passed overhead, galloping away in clusters. They stopped when the sun reached its zenith, descending to a small watering hole ringed by tall grass. Daenerys dismounted with a groan of relief, stretching her stiff limbs. She let Drogon drink his fill, eyeing the horizon for any sign of Dothraki outriders. The Dothraki sea was vast and open, making it easy to spot large khalasars from afar, at least in theory. But it also meant that if a patrol saw them first, they might not have the advantage of stealth. Daenerys remembered how she had once wielded the influence of a khalasar to reclaim her strength, how she had burned down the Dash Khaleen temple and emerged unburnt, cementing her legend among the horse lords. Would they still revere her, or had rumor and time changed their perception? She turned to Malthero, who leaned against Drogon's flank for support. "We'll rest here for a bit," Daenerys said. "Then continue. I suspect we can make a decent camp by nightfall near one of the known streams if I remember the terrain correctly." Malthero only nodded, breath still uneven. Daenerys gently touched their shoulder, mindful of the bandage. "Is it worse?" They shook their head. "No. Just tired. The flight jars it." Daenerys felt a stab of guilt. "I'm sorry. If you need more time, we can proceed on foot at least for a while." Malthero managed a faint smile. Walking miles on foot would be no less painful. They gestured at Drogon. "Better he carry us if he can. Then we can rest more thoroughly when we find a safe haven." A safe haven. Daenerys wondered what shape that would take in a land where she had so many complicated histories. She forced herself to remain practical for the moment. She and Malthero drank from the watering hole, carefully checking for signs that it was uncontaminated. Drogon snorted at a small crocodilian creature lurking in the reeds, but it slithered away, wanting no fight with a dragon. They shared a bit of dried tuber, though Daenerys' stomach growled for something more substantial. Still, she had grown used to hunger in her earlier journeys. It felt oddly familiar. They took to the sky again, Daenerys scanning the endless rolling grasslands that shone under the midday sun. Eventually, they spotted a winding river in the distance, flanked by sparse trees. Daenerys guided Drogon downward, recalling that the Dothraki often used such rivers as campsites or gathering grounds. If they encountered a small khalasar or a wandering group, she might attempt negotiation. If they recognized her, it could go any number of ways. But the spot she chose appeared deserted, just a wide bend in the river with shallows near the bank and tall grass that could conceal Drogon if he crouched low. They landed, the grass rustling in waves. Dragon footprints soon pressed into the muddy shore, drawing water into the depressions. Daenerys dismounted, wincing at the twinge in her ribs, and took a moment to observe the horizon. No horses, no smoke from campfires, no sign of man or woman. She turned to Malthero. "We'll set camp here for the night. You can rest in the shade and Drogon can hunt if need be. I'll keep watch." They removed the makeshift harness of supplies from Drogon's back and found a patch of level ground beneath a stunted tree, though it was more a spindly trunk with a few leaves than real shelter. Still, it offered some respite from the sun. Daenerys helped Malthero sit, propping them against a smooth rock. Their wound looked stable, no fresh bleeding had seeped through. She offered them water, then set about gathering dry driftwood along the riverbank to form a small fire pit. As she worked, her thoughts drifted. She remembered traveling with a khalasar, how thousands of Dothraki had filled the plains with the thunder of hoofs. She recalled the swirl of braids, the clang of rocks, the clash of proud tempers. She had been an outsider at first, a frightened girl given to Khal Drogo in marriage, then had become Khaleesi, forging bonds of loyalty through a mixture of cunning, empathy, and ultimately fire. Now, returning here felt like stepping into the shadow of her own origin story. Would the land itself remember her? Once she had a small pile of firewood assembled, she paused, hands on her hips. Drogon had already stretched out in the grass, head lowered, golden eyes half-lidded as he basked in the sun. They had not truly flown so far in a single day since leaving Valyria. She wondered if he felt as uncertain as she did. He had followed her across oceans and deserts through triumph and catastrophe. Now they were simply lost, in a sense, searching for direction. She approached him, stroking his flank. "We're going to be all right," she whispered. "I promise." Drogon rumbled deep in his throat. She felt that stirring of warmth in her chest that connected them, a gentle reassurance. Even if the rest of the world turned on her, Drogon remained. That bond gave her the faintest flicker of hope. She lit a small fire using flint and steel she'd taken from a slaver's corpse, coaxing the flames to catch on the dry grass and driftwood. The smoke rose in a thin trail, hopefully not enough to draw attention from too far away. Malthero dozed in the shade, their chest rising and falling in shallow but regular patterns. Daenerys rummaged through their supplies, finding some leftover dried roots and a scrap of goat meat, courtesy of Drogon's hunts, that she could roast. It was not a feast, but it would sustain them. As she worked, she felt the hush of the plains settle over her, the rustle of grass in the breeze, the hum of insects near the river, the distant cry of waterfowl. It almost lulled her into forgetting her pains. Yet behind the tranquil facade lay the knowledge that any moment, a Dothraki Khalasar, a band of raiders, or some other threat could appear. But living in fear would gain her nothing. She recalled how once she had embraced the Dothraki ways, forging a path through savage trials. Could she do it again without losing herself to brutality? She fed Malthero small bites of roasted goat, ensuring they ate. Then she ate her own meager portion, washing it down with river water that she had boiled to kill off potential sickness. The day passed in relative calm. Drogon napped, rising occasionally to prowl the river's edge, snapping at fish or small creatures. Malthero drifted in and out of sleep, each time looking a little steadier, though their wound remained tender. Daenerys tended to them in quiet devotion, remembering how Malthero had once knelt beside her lifeless body in Valyria and poured life back into her veins. This was the least she could do in return. Near sunset, Daenerys ventured upstream alone to see if she could gather any additional herbs or edible plants. She carried the slaver's sword belted at her waist, her senses alert for trouble. The grass rustled around her knees, and once or twice she heard distant hoofbeats, but she saw no riders. She collected a handful of wild onions and a spiky plant she recognized from her Dothraki days that, when crushed, yielded a mild antiseptic. She returned to camp and used a flat stone to grind the plant, applying the pulp to Malthero's wound. They grimaced at the sting, but then nodded in approval. Darkness spread across the plains. The sky turned a deep indigo, stars winking into view. Daenerys felt a surge of memories from the nights she'd spent beneath these same stars, with Ricardo, Aggo, and Jogo standing guard around the fires. She remembered Khal Drogo's presence beside her, how she had once believed their future would stretch on forever. Fate had other plans. Now, with the flickering orange glow of her modest fire, she almost felt like that young Khaleesi again, except the ghosts of her past weighed on her shoulders. She was older, scarred in body and soul, half wondering if the land itself recognized the changed woman who had returned. She watched Malthero stir and sit up, leaning against a rock. Their eyes glimmered in the firelight. "How far will we journey into the plains?" they asked softly. Daenerys folded her arms around her knees. "Far enough to find a safe place. Maybe a small group of herders or a deserted spot where we can build a shelter of our own. I don't have illusions of rebuilding an army." She hesitated. "Unless circumstances force it. But I came here mostly to hide, to heal. I have no desire to wage a new war." Malthero studied her face. "Yet war may come to you if word spreads. You cannot remain anonymous forever. The night with the slavers showed how quickly violence finds you." Daenerys rubbed her eyes, fatigue pressing in. "I know. Perhaps, if I can learn to control the power awakened in Valyria, I can defend myself without resorting to wholesale destruction. I'm not who I was. I refuse to be." She thought of the city she had burned, the throne she had sought. The swirling guilt never left her completely. "But I will defend those who are defenseless if it's within my power." A faint nod from Malthero. "Perhaps that can be atonement of a sort." She did not reply. Atonement? Could the act of saving a few from slavers truly balance the scales for what she had done? She sighed. "Let's rest," she said. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." She fed another stick to the fire, letting sparks drift upward, then lay on her side, cloak pulled over her. Drogon settled close, forming a partial windbreak with his massive body. Malthero nestled beside the embers, wincing but eventually finding a semblance of comfort. That night, Daenerys again dreamed of King's Landing, but the city was transformed into rolling plains. The Red Keep's towers became tall grass that swayed in the breeze, and she wandered among them, searching for faces she had lost. She caught glimpses of Missandei, of Grey Worm, of Yora, but each time she drew near, they vanished. In the distance, she saw the Iron Throne standing alone in a field of ash, and as she approached, it crumbled into dust, leaving only a single dragon's egg. She reached for the egg, half expecting it to open. A voice, perhaps her own, perhaps another's, whispered, "What are you now?" She had no answer. She woke just before dawn, tears dried on her cheeks. The fire was little more than embers painting the world in a faint glow. Drogon dozed, chest rising and falling. Malthero stirred, blinking at her. The sky lightened, revealing a promise of another day in the wide, golden grasslands. Daenerys forced herself to her feet, rolling her shoulders. Her chest ached dully, a reminder that she was still not fully healed. Malthero tested their bandaged shoulder and winced, but managed to stand. They broke their simple camp, scattering the ashes of the fire. Drogon stretched his wings, releasing a long, hissing yawn. The day felt crisp, the grass shimmering with morning dew. Once again, they mounted the dragon and soared east, scanning the horizon for signs of life. As hours passed, the grass grew taller, the land flatter. The sun climbed steadily. It might have been midday when Daenerys finally glimpsed a thin plume of smoke rising in the distance. A settlement of some kind. Perhaps Dothraki, perhaps not. She guided Drogon into a low arc, approaching carefully. The settlement was not large, just a cluster of yurts and tents, maybe 20 or 30, arranged around a central cooking fire. A few horses grazed nearby. Daenerys recognized the style of dwellings, definitely Dothraki. But there were no massive herds, no throngs of warriors. This seemed more like a small offshoot or maybe a group of exiles. She felt a flutter of both hope and anxiety. Some Dothraki might still revere her, but others might resent or even hate her for the path she had taken. If they recognized her, how would they react? She signaled Drogon to circle from a distance, seeking to gauge the camp's reaction. The moment the watchers spotted the dragon overhead, alarm spread. Figures pointed, some scrambled for weapons, others ran for the horses. Daenerys hovered uncertainly, debating whether to land. Malthero clutched her waist, tense. She could see that the camp had fewer than 100 people total. If these were breakaway Dothraki or a small Khalasar, they might remember legends of the Dragon Queen who walked through fire. Then again, legends could sour over time. Before she could make a final decision, she saw a tall figure in the center of the camp raise both arms, beckoning them. Some others around him lowered their weapons, apparently heeding his command. Daenerys' heartbeat thundered. She urged Drogon to land slowly at the camp's edge, letting dust swirl around them. At once, the Dothraki formed a half-circle, cautious but curious, a few brandishing rocks. The tall figure stepped forward, wearing the typical Dothraki vest and horsehair belt, his dark hair braided once, indicating some measure of rank but not a great Khal status. Scars crisscrossed his muscled arms. He regarded Drogon with wide eyes, though not purely in fear. There was a flicker of recognition, as if he'd heard the stories of a dragon-riding Khaleesi. Daenerys slid down from Drogon's back, her legs shaking slightly. Malthero followed, leaning against her for support. The Dothraki parted warily. Drogon hissed, swinging his head around, flames simmering in his throat. She laid a hand on his flank, murmuring soothingly, then stepped forward alone. Her heart pounded as she mustered the old Dothraki phrases she had once used so fluently. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen," she said in a clear voice. "The Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea. I come seeking peace." A ripple of astonishment spread through the gathered watchers. Some murmured her name in half-disbelief. The tall man frowned, glancing at the others. "I know the stories," he said at last, in Dothraki that was rough but understandable. "They say the Dragon Queen left for the far side of the sea, that she died in a foreign city of stone." Daenerys swallowed. She had to pick her words carefully. "I was betrayed," she said simply, letting the sorrow color her tone. "I have returned to the Grass Sea for shelter, not war." A few of the Dothraki muttered to each other. One spat. Another asked, "If you are she, where's your Khalasar?" She could only bow her head. "Lost," she replied softly. "I have only my dragon and a companion." She gestured to Malthero. "We are wounded, weary. We ask for your hospitality." An uneasy silence stretched. Then the tall man stepped closer, eyeing her silver hair and the scars peeking from her collar, including the faint outlines of the dagger's wound that marred her chest. He seemed torn between skepticism and wonder. Finally, he spoke, voice carrying. Long ago, I heard Khal Moro speak of a silver-haired Khaleesi who made the Dash Khaleen temple burn with her anger, who united the Dothraki to follow her across the sea. Some say she freed slaves and made herself a queen in the lands of stone men. Others say she died in flame and blood. He looked her in the eyes. Which story is true? She inhaled, remembering the night she had burned the Khals who threatened her in V's Dothraki. Both, she said quietly. I freed thousands, but I also died. Or nearly so. Now I am here. If you doubt me, I will leave, but I swear I mean you no harm. The Dothraki exchanged glances. Finally, an older woman, her hair shot through with gray, approached with cautious steps. She peered at Daenerys, then at Drogon. Her eyes flicked back to Daenerys with a faint tremor of awe. I remember the day the Khal temple burned, she said in a rasping voice. I was with the Dash Khaleen. You walked out of the fire untouched. That is not easily forgotten. The tall man, apparently their leader, lowered his gaze in thought. At length, he lifted his head. We are a small khalasar, once loyal to Khal Jacko. But many things changed after the Great Wars. Some of us parted ways. We wander now as the Dothraki do. He studied Daenerys. We have no reason to fight you if you bring no threat. Daenerys exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. I only ask a safe place to rest for a short time, food, water, perhaps a healer if you have one. My companion is wounded. The older woman stepped forward, beckoning gently. I know some healing arts, she said. She turned to Malthero, eyes narrowing at the bloodstains. Sit with me. Malthero, though hesitant, allowed the woman to guide them to a nearby mat. The circle of Dothraki parted, though curiosity was thick in the air. Drogon crouched, watchful, his tail lashing occasionally. Daenerys placed a hand on his shoulder to keep him calm. Then she followed, hoping this tentative acceptance would hold. She recalled the Dothraki custom of strength and show of force. In the past, she had conquered the entire khalasar by outmaneuvering the Khals in V's Dothraki. Now she had come in peace. Would they view that as weakness? She prayed the times had changed enough for them to show mercy. The tall man, who introduced himself as Zetek, led Daenerys to the central cooking fire. She recognized the heady aroma of spiced horsemeat stew, a staple of Dothraki diets. A few riders remained tense, hands on their araks, but Zetek told them to stand down. The older woman, named Yara, Daenerys gathered, inspected Malthero's wound with the critical eye of someone accustomed to patching up injuries. She asked Daenerys a few questions in Dothraki, and Daenerys replied haltingly, explaining that Malthero had been cut by a sword many days ago, that they had tried to treat it with herbs. Yara nodded, rummaging among her supplies for a jar of pungent paste. She smeared it over the cut, muttering that it would burn but help cleanse. Daenerys hovered anxiously, sensing Malthero's pain. She felt the echo in her own body. She pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to quell the wave of sympathy. Malthero hissed but did not protest, letting Yara finish her work. Then the older woman bandaged the shoulder anew with strips of clean cloth. Rest, she instructed in a tone that brooked no argument. If the infection does not take hold, you will live. Malthero inclined their head in gratitude, though their face remained ashen. Daenerys felt some relief. She turned to Zetek. Thank you for allowing this. She paused, unsure how to proceed, mindful that the Dothraki valued frankness. I will repay you if I can. Zetek considered her, expression guarded. If you are truly the Dragon Queen, your presence alone is repayment. Some among us still speak of the day you rode a dragon in V's Dothraki, uniting the khalasars to sail across the sea. They say you broke chains in the lands of slavers. He glanced at Drogon, who lurked at the perimeter, drawing gasps whenever he moved. But there are also darker whispers that you burned cities and left them in ruins. Daenerys' throat felt tight. She could almost hear the question, which story is true? Again, she had to weigh her words. I did what I thought was right, she said at last. I cannot deny that many burned. I have regrets, but I cannot change what happened. I only seek to live now without causing more harm. Zetek's face remained inscrutable. Then we shall see if the grass sea is large enough for all who dwell here. He gestured at the tents. For now, eat and rest. Show that you are not our enemy and we will not be yours. Daenerys bowed her head in gratitude. The Dothraki parted to let her pass, some still eyeing Drogon warily. She coaxed him closer to the edge of the camp, setting him near a clearing where he could lie without trampling the yurts. She promised him fresh meat if the Dothraki would spare a goat or horse for him, or if he could hunt once night fell. Then she returned to Malthero's side. Yara offered Daenerys a bowl of stew, which she accepted, though she tested it carefully, old instincts reminding her of the attempt on her life years ago when a wine cellar tried to poison her. But the stew seemed genuine, and her hunger overcame her caution. Malthero nibbled on a piece of flatbread, wincing whenever they moved their arm. Daenerys took a seat on a small cushion, feeling the eyes of the camp upon them. She forced herself to remain composed, remembering how to conduct herself in Dothraki gatherings, never show fear, but do not posture aggressively unless she was prepared to fight. She glanced around, noting that many of these folk appeared underfed. Children huddled near the fires, wide-eyed at the sight of the dragon. Elderly men and women carried on chores quietly. This was not the robust Khalasar of old. It looked more like a group of survivors clinging to the old ways in uncertain times. The hours slipped by. Daenerys answered a few cautious questions from Zetek and another man who acted as his second. They asked about the war across the sea, about rumors of a monstrous army of the dead. She confirmed the existence of the White Walkers, though they had been defeated before she died. That news drew astonishment. The Dothraki were famously skeptical of supernatural threats, yet they had once followed her to war against them. When asked about who now ruled the lands beyond the sea, Daenerys did not lie. She explained that a new king had been chosen after her downfall, though she avoided naming him. She sensed that dredging up the entire story of Jon Snow might only spark more questions about her own demise. Night fell, and the Dothraki lit additional fires. A cautious sense of acceptance settled over the camp, though tension lingered in the air. Daenerys volunteered to let Drogon hunt a wild horse or deer rather than demand one from the Khalasar's herds, hoping to show respect. Zetek agreed, watching with fascination as Daenerys commanded Drogon with a quiet word. The great dragon launched skyward, disappearing into the star-flecked darkness. Malthero dozed in a yurt offered by Yara, who intended to watch over their healing. Daenerys sat by the main fire, silent, remembering nights of old when she had shared jugs of fermented mare's milk and listened to Dothraki boasts. Now she felt like a shadow of the woman she once was, a vestige of a legend that had ended in betrayal. A group of younger riders approached Zetek's tent, speaking in low voices that Daenerys could not fully catch. She saw them gesturing in her direction, expressions grim. She guessed they were arguing about the wisdom of harboring her. One might have called her a cursed queen. Another spoke angrily about how the Dothraki who followed her across the sea never returned, or if they did, they came back with half their numbers. Daenerys' chest constricted. She had not known how many might have survived the wars in Westeros or how they found their way back to the Grass Sea. She reminded herself that her decisions had affected countless lives. Here was another reminder of that. Unable to bear the suspicious glances, she rose and wandered outside the ring of firelight, seeking solitude. The grass whispered around her ankles. She gazed up at the sky. From a distance, she heard faint laughter, then an argument, then the quiet hush of a camp settling in for the night. She closed her eyes, letting the wind tug at her silver hair. The old guilt and grief throbbed like an unhealed wound, but she tried to breathe through it. She was here, among the Dothraki again, if only for a short while. Perhaps this was where she needed to be, at least until Malthero recovered. Then they would move on, drifting like ghosts across Essos, searching for a purpose in a second life that felt both miraculous and burdensome. She heard the beat of wings. Drogon returned, landing outside the camp with a muffled impact. Daenerys moved to meet him, laying a hand on his steaming muzzle, smelling fresh blood on his breath. He had fed, apparently on some beast. She felt his contentment ripple through their bond. He nuzzled her gently, almost knocking her off balance. She let out a soft, rueful laugh. "Careful," she murmured. "We're among friends of a sort." She doubted Drogon understood the concept. He only understood threat or no threat, nest or no nest. But she cherished the moment of closeness. With him by her side, she felt less adrift. Whatever the Dothraki might say, she was not alone. Returning to the camp's edge, she found a space near Yara's yurt where she could settle for the night. Some Dothraki still eyed Drogon warily, but none approached with hostility. Daenerys pulled her cloak tight around her shoulders and sat by a small, smoldering fire. The grass sea stretched around them under the moonlight, endless and secretive. She thought of the journey yet to come, what awaited her beyond these plains, what shape her redemption or atonement might take, if any. She had no tidy answers, only an unbreakable will to keep trying. And so she kept vigil until her eyelids grew heavy. Eventually, she sank into an uneasy sleep, lulled by the lullaby of the wind through the grasses. In her dreams, she was once again in Valyria, the molten city whispering its secrets. But this time, instead of darkness, she saw faint green flames that guided her along ancient corridors. She heard echoes of voices chanting in an older Valyrian tongue, promising that the dragon's blood was never truly extinguished, that every ending could herald a new beginning. When she emerged into full wakefulness again, the sky was pearlescent with dawn and the Dothraki camp was stirring. A new day had come, and Daenerys Targaryen, twice-born, rose to meet it, uncertain, haunted, but determined to walk forward into whatever fate the world still held for her.